Look for the blood god.
G'day guys, welcome to this World Eaters Masterclass. I've played nothing but competitive World Eaters for the entirety of 10th edition. I've interviewed dozens of top tier players, done breakdowns of all sorts of different tournament content, and it's about time that I put all of that information together, all of that learning and experience together, and present a masterclass on this faction for those of you looking to improve your results, or those of you looking to get into the faction now. So we're going to break down a whole ton of different content in this video. We're going to talk about the army rule, the detachment rule, and the stratagems. Whilst breaking these down, we're going to pull up the app, we're going to go through all of the army rules, we're going to go through everything you need to know about the blessings of Khorne, we're going to be going through the detachment, we're going to talk about all of the different enhancements, which ones you're going to want to consider and which ones you're going to want to overlook, and we're going to break down each and every stratagem. We're going to look into what the stratagems do, which ones are particularly powerful, and which ones you would not want to waste the command points on. We're also going to dig through every single detachment available to the World Eaters, and we're going to talk about which ones are really powerful, auto-includes, must-take units, which ones are passable and available to be selected based on your preferences, and which ones you definitely want to leave on the shelf collecting dust for now until a balanced data slate changes things. We're going to break down these units in great detail. We're also going to be breaking down 6 different example lists that I've written for you guys here today. So we're going to be talking about a balanced meta-style list. We're going to talk about a more MSU skewed list, one that focuses heavy on berserkers, one that's got a lot of mechanized components like your Mauler Fiends, your Forge Fiends, etc. One that's got the big bad Lord of Skulls in it for those who want to play with those bigger models, and also a list that doesn't include Angron for those of you who want to take a slightly off-meta, slightly different view of the World Eaters. So there's going to be tons of options here. We're going to break down the pros and cons of each list. We're going to talk about the strengths and why you might want to consider them, and also how you can adapt them to your personal preferences and your personal favor. And this is going to allow you to bring a competitively viable World Eaters list that you're passionate about and that you're going to have a ton of fun playing and get some fantastic results. After we talk about the various army lists, we're going to be giving some practical advice on deployment based on different types of maps, where your opponent deploys their models, where you want to deploy your models, and how to get the best use out of your army list and make sure that you are bringing those competitive advantages of your list to bear on the battlefield. And last but absolutely not least, we're going to be talking about some different combat tricks. We're going to put models out here, we're going to have a practical examples of where to move your Rhino, where to move your Berserkers, how to deal with various opponent threats, some different tricks that you can use to make combat a nightmare for your opponent, and some different ways that you can get around tricks that your opponent is trying to wield to make combat a nightmare for you. So if any or all of that sounds interesting to you, strap in. This is going to be quite the long video, but I guarantee you it's going to be packed full of stuff that you're going to find interesting. So let's get stuck straight into the video. Alrighty guys, let's just dive straight in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the army rule, the detachments, the stratagems, etc. So first, let's take a look at the army rule for the World Eaters. It's pretty straightforward. It's called the Blessings of Khorne. And basically, at the start of the battle round, you're going to roll 8 dice, and then based on the results of those dice, you're going to select something from a menu of options, and that's going to be an army-wide rule that's going to apply to your forces. So it's really, really powerful. This is arguably one of the most powerful army rules in my personal opinion. It's very, very good because it affects your entire army and you get a lot of agency. You get to select what you can get. So the options are, you can use, of those 8 dice, you can use any double to get Rage Fueled Invigoration, which is +2 to the movement characteristic of your army. Now, already straight out the gate, that's massively powerful. And the beautiful thing about this one is it only requires any double. So it's not possible to not roll a double when you're rolling 8 dice, because you roll a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you've still got 2 more dice to roll, guaranteed to be the same result as 2 of those other dice. So you're guaranteed to get this if you want it. And being able to have things like Terminators that move 7 inches, 8-bound moving 11 inches, Berserkers moving 8 inches, disembarking from a Rhino giving them an additional 3. Like, you can get really, really fast units in your army using this ability. The next one that we have is called RAFFLE Devotion, and it basically gives you an army-wide 6-up Feel No Pain, which is a massive durability boost. It simultaneously is that 16% damage reduction because every 6th wound you're going to pass on a Feel No Pain, but it's actually slightly more than that when you consider that World Eaters have a lot of 3-wound models, and if they get hit by a 3-damage attack, that would normally have killed them. But now, you're going to roll 3 dice, and as long as one of those 3 is a 6, which you've got a roughly 50% chance of doing, you're actually going to negate an entire additional shot. So it's kind of a 50% increase in durability in some ways. It's also worth noting that if your unit already has a 6-up Feel No Pain, this improves to a 5-up Feel No Pain. So things like Jackals and Exalted 8-Bound absolutely love this ability. And once again, all you need to do is roll any double to unlock this ability, which is really, really cool. The next one is Martial Excellence. This is any double 3+, so a double 1 or a double 2 won't unlock this, but any other double will do so. And basically it gives you sustained hits 1. Now this ability is also really fantastic. It's a huge increase in the damage output, particularly if you have Angron nearby and you're able to re-roll your hits because you're able to get another shot at getting one of those 6-up sustained hits. So that's really good. We'll talk about that in a bit, how you want to use that. Next we have Total Carnage on a double 4+ or any triple, right? You can then basically fight on death on a 4+. So when your opponent charges into your units and kills you, you roll a dice, and on a 4+, you get to fight before removing that model. This is really, really crazy on something like Angron, who has a massive damage output, because if you roll that 4-up, whatever just killed Angron in melee is going to die as well. So that's really, really wild, particularly in some matchups. Then we've got Warp Blades. This is a double 5+ or any triple. And what this one's going to do is it's going to allow you to get lethal hits, which is really, really powerful on things like Khorne Berserkers or Jackals who have a high volume of attacks that's relatively low strength. And once again, if you can combine this with a nearby Angron for re-rolling hits, you're going to start putting out serious damage into tough targets with your smaller things like your Jackals and Berserkers. So that one's really, really good as well. And then last, but absolutely not least, if you roll on those 8 dice, a double 6, or triple 4+, you can get army-wide advance and charge, which is absolutely phenomenal. And it's worth noting you can select 2 things from this menu. So if you roll 3 4s and 2 5s, you can go, cool, I'm going to use the 3 4s to get advance and charge. I'm going to use the 2 5s to get +2 move. And now my Terminators that were moving 5 inches before, they're actually moving 7 plus D6 inches. So massive, massive movement buff that you can apply to your army. Now, while talking about the detachment rules, let's talk about which ones you want to select, because that's often the part that people get stuck on, is they're sitting there and they're like, it's my turn, I've rolled my blessings, and they just get paralysis, because you have so many options to choose from, which is normally a really good thing, but it can chew into and stress you out when you're trying to figure out which ones to pick. So my practical advice is that on the first turn, you're generally going to want the +2 move and advance and charge, because that's going to allow you to project massive amounts of damage and get your army up into your opponent's lines. But once you're there, you no longer really need the +2 move, and you no longer need the advance and charge, because you're already right up in your opponent's face. So that's when you pivot over and start taking things like the 6-up Feel No Pain, things like the sustained hits, and that way you're in your opponent's army, and now you're really tough, and you hit really hard, and the speed is no longer a relevant piece of the puzzle. So that's a general vibe, but it's going to depend on who goes first, because if your opponent's going first and your army's exposed, then you want to take the 6-up Feel No Pain at the start of the battle round, so that when they hit you with their damage, they don't just table you. Or if your opponent has heavy combat army, you're going to be wanting to take that Total Carnage and get that 4-up fights on death. If you're in a mirror match, for example, you're both probably going to be taking the 4-up fights on death. If you're versing something combat heavy like Orcs or Chaos Space Marines or something like that, you're going to want to go, cool, I'm going to take that fight on death and I'm going to deploy myself and I'm going to basically push up into the middle, let you hit me, that's fine, because I'm going to fight on death and take you out anyway. So it's very powerful because you can modify your strategy based on your opponent and based on whether or not you're going first or second. So this army rule is absolutely fantastic. And it's also worth noting here, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we break down Angron's data sheet, but Angron has an ability that means you can use 3 of the dice, if you roll 3 6s, to resurrect Angron. So that's insanely powerful as well, and that is another part of what makes the Blessings of Khorne an amazing army rule for the World Eaters. Alrighty guys, if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, I implore you to show your support for this channel by joining our fundraiser raffle, where you can get a prize which is going to be a set of 6 of these neoprene objective markers and 50 of these Blog for the Blood God high quality premium dice. If you want to show your support, there's links in the description. Pause the video now, jump over to that raffle, takes 2 seconds, buy a raffle ticket for 10 bucks or whatever, and that's a great way to show your support and allow me to continue producing high quality content like the one you're enjoying right now. So if you want to show your support, that's a great way to do it. And with that being said, let's get back into the video. Alright, now that we've broken down the army rule, let's look at the detachment. Now, there's only one detachment available to world leaders at the moment due to it being an index, but let's have a look at what we've got. So there's enhancements in this. So hang on, let's go back and look at the detachment rule. It's basically when you finish a charge move this turn, you get +1 to your attacks and strength. So it's not the best detachment rule in the world, but it does mean that things like your Khorne Berserkers get extra strength and extra attacks, making them a genuine threat. And bigger things like Angron or Mauler Fiends, that extra attack is an extra Angron level attack. So it's really good on your hard-hitting stuff. It's also really good on your chaff. So it's a really universal and powerful rule. It's not particularly good on things like Forge Fiends, but they're not necessarily something that we're building our armies around anyway. So this is an amazing rule on our best units, and it doesn't really matter on our less powerful units. So all in all, I think this is an amazing detachment rule. But the real power in this detachment is the stratagems. We'll talk about the enhancements first, though. You've got Favored of Khorne for 20 points, and basically this is going to allow you to re-roll those 8 dice that you roll at the start of the game. It's also worth noting with that Blessings of Khorne, and we'll talk about this in more detail with the units and the data sheets, but if you have Jackals or Berserkers on an objective, you can re-roll any one of those dice, and then if you take the Favored of Khorne, you can re-roll the whole lot. So there's a lot of different ways that you can manipulate the Blessings of Khorne, and this is a good way to do it. I actually think that this is a very powerful thing. You can only use this once per game, which is kind of disappointing, but you'll often find that there's that one turn where you really need advance and charge, or there's that one turn where you really need to be able to fight on death, and if you don't get it, the whole game plan can fall apart. So giving yourself the capacity to re-roll that is amazing. It also does give you the capacity to get Angron back slightly more reliably, but that's something you should probably never be banking on anyway. So all of that considered, I think if you do have a character that doesn't currently have an enhancement, Favored of Khorne is one that's definitely worth considering and is definitely worth the 20 points. The other one that we've got here is the Berserker's Glaive. This one is traditionally used on a Master of Executions. It's very, very powerful on him because it takes his 2 damage weapon up 1 strength and 1 attack, which means he's now going in with 3 damage, devastating wounds, and against enemy characters, he's rerolling all of his hits and wound rolls, making this guy an absolute blender into enemy characters. I've seen him kill things like Mortarion in combat with ease. So this guy's an absolute monster and is really, really powerful. So if you're taking a Master of Executions, this is definitely one worth considering. Next, we have Battle Lust. Now, this one is also really worth considering on a Master of Executions. It's fantastic because it allows you to select his unit with the Heroic Intervention stratagem for 0 command points, even if another unit has already used it. Because normally you can only use stratagem once per phase. This is going to allow you to heroically intervene twice, which is pretty wild. But importantly, it's going to let you do it for free. And the Master of Executions is the best target for this because that allows the Berserkers to heroically intervene for free, whereas if you took this and put it on something like a Demon Prince, only the Demon Prince can heroically intervene for free, whereas this confers the ability to the unit, which is really powerful. And also, the Master of Executions gives that unit fights first. So that means that you're going to be able to heroically intervene into something and then hit it before it gets to strike, which is pretty wild. And when we talk about the combat tips and tricks later, when we get out some models and show you some different abilities and tricks you can use, there's some really interesting stuff that you can do when you can heroically intervene and fight first. It's absolutely wild. So this is a really, really powerful stratagem, enhancement, sorry. And then the last one is the Helm of Brazen Ire, which basically halves incoming damage for the bearer. So this one, obviously, this is not fantastic on a Master of Executions because A, he's already squishy as hell and he's going to die anyway, and B, it's only on the bearer, so it doesn't impact his unit. This one's really, really powerful on your Demon Princes and things of that nature that are already really tough with 2-up saves and 4-up invulnerable saves and a handful of wounds, and that makes him really hard to kill, especially when you go, cool, now he's half damage, which means 2 damage weapons are half as effective. It's really, really good on something like that. So they're your enhancements. They're all of them are really good. There's no bad enhancements there. Stratagems. This is where the world leaders get really, really powerful and really crazy. So first one we've got is Gory Massacre. This is probably the worst stratagem of the bunch, where basically you spend one command point after you kill an enemy unit in the fight phase, and then in your opponent's subsequent command phase, every unit within 6 inches of your unit must take a battle shock test. So this can be useful if you've got like a nice big unit of Khorne Berserkers that strings out, and when you charge them, you kill something small, and then you're within 6 inches of every model in their army, and you can just force them to take an army-wide battle shock test. However, there's no real modifiers to their battle shock result, like you can't impact your opponent's leadership or anything like that, and because it's a battle shock test that's taken in their command phase, they can use the Insane Bravery stratagem to negate one of these. So it's good, it does have its uses, but it's the worst of the bunch. It is an amazing bunch of stratagems, though, so being the worst of that bunch isn't necessarily a bad thing. The next stratagem we've got is Skulls for the Skull Throne, 1 CP. Basically, you take a unit that hasn't fought yet this phase, and if they're targeting a character, vehicle, or a monster, they gain +1 to their wound rolls. Now, this is absolutely monstrous. This turns one of those Khorne Berserker units into an absolute mech-killing machine. It's also really good on things like an Exalted 8-bound unit, because you can get them wounding on 2s. You can get Angron wounding almost all vehicles on, like, pretty much all vehicles on 2s, which is fantastic. It just dials the damage output of your units up, and is one of those ones that you're going to want to basically save a CP for each turn if you're versing something that's mech heavy. It's also worth noting that it's character units, so if your opponent has a unit that has a character in it, that unit, attached unit, counts as a character unit. So if you charge Khorne Berserkers into their unit and then spend this CP, all of your Khorne Berserkers, your bodyguard, get the +1 to wound when targeting that unit, even though they're not targeting the character specifically. So this is really, really powerful at dealing with your opponent's sort of Death Star style units. If they've got like a unit of Terminators with a character attached and they think this is this big, tough, unkillable brick, and then you throw in your Berserkers, you spend this CP, you get +1 to wound on all of your Berserkers attacks, your Master of Executions precisions out their character, and then you go Vushka and you kill the whole unit. Absolutely insane. So this is a really good stratagem. The next one is Blood for the Blood God, so it's 1 CP. You use this after you've fought, if you've killed an enemy unit, and then basically you get to make a Blessings of Khorne roll. So this is obviously also really powerful, because like we said, those Blessings of Khorne abilities are all fantastic, and this allows you to add one to your current rolls. So if you made a roll at the start of the turn, you got +2 move, and you got Advance and Charge. You then turn 1, Advance and Charged out, and killed something. You can then spend 1 command point, make another roll, and now you're going to get Feel No Pain as well. So you get to have the durability buff and the damage dealing buff. Another way that you can use this is if you charge something, you've got multiple combats happening across the table, you've charged one thing, you kill it, then you spend the CP to get another blessing, you use that to activate sustained hits, and then your next units that fight within the rest of the phase are all going to have sustained hits. And most people would spend 1 CP for sustained hits, so being able to spend 1 CP to make a Blessings roll to potentially activate sustained hits army-wide is absolutely fantastic. Another real cool trick you can do with this is if you're expecting your opponent to interrupt using the counter-offensive stratagem, you can charge 2 units in, you fight with the first one, you kill the enemy unit, and then you use one of these to turn fights on death on, and then when they interrupt and kill your unit, you get to fight on death and kill them as well. So there's tons of really, really cool stuff you can do with this, and this is one of those ones that you're going to use a lot. You're going to use it slightly less often if you get the second turn. If you get, in the battle round, your opponent goes first, then you go. Because if you go and kill something in your fight phase, the very next thing that happens is the start of a new battle round, in which case you're going to make a new Blessings roll. So being able to do this at the end of the turn, at the bottom of the turn, is less powerful. Whereas if you get the first turn and you're able to go in and kill something and then activate it and it lasts for the rest of that turn until the next battle round, that's really, really crazy. So this stratagem definitely has its uses. Next we have Khorne Cares Not. Now this is our only 2 command point stratagem, which is very expensive. However, it allows you to apply -1 damage in melee, and this is going to turn your tough units into insanely tough units. If your opponent charges Angron with a whole bunch of, power fists or, something of that nature where they're about to put a whole bunch of 2 damage attacks into you. You have the 6 up Feel No Pain from your blessings, and then you spend 2 command points to put neg 1 damage on him. There's almost nothing that's going to effectively kill Angron through that toughness. Or if someone's hitting your, 8 bound with a bunch of 3 damage attacks, and you go, cool, I'm going to put neg 1 damage on. Well, now they're hitting with 2 damage attacks, which means it takes 2 blows to successfully kill 1 8 bound instead of 1. So it doubles the durability of your 8 bound. So this one is absolutely fantastic, and in the combat matchups, it's absolutely brutal. It's not as relevant in the shooting matchups, of course, because this does only affect you in the fight phase, so it's worth noting that. Next, we've got Blood Offering. Now, this is probably one of my favorite stratagems in the entire game, where basically when one of your units dies, you can spend 1 command point, and if they were holding an objective marker, that objective marker remains under your control until your opponent takes it off of you. There's some really, really neat tricks you can do with this stratagem, and it's one of those ones where often it's going to translate to you spend 1 command point, and it's going to get you a minimum of 5 victory points, because if they kill you off of an objective, well, you don't control it in your next command phase, and therefore you're not going to get the primary victory points. Whereas if you can sticky it using this stratagem, that's amazingly powerful. So we'll talk about that in more details when we get the models out. We do some practical examples, but that Blood Offering is an absolutely amazing stratagem. What else have we got in here? The last one, which is Apoplectic Frenzy, which is 1 command point, and this is also one of the best stratagems we have available to us, where basically when you go to advance, instead of making an advance roll, you just automatically move 6 inches, which means when you have advance and charge from your Blessings of Khorne, you're going to be able to take something like 8 bound, which normally have a 9-inch move. You're going to go plus 2 inches move from the Blessings, so now you're moving 11 inches. Then you're going to advance, and you're going to use this CP to make that advance auto 6, which is insanely fast. This is one of the things that makes the World Eaters the fastest army in the game, and allows us to really, really bully our opponents by being safe and hidden, but still threatening them with combat from across the board. So this stratagems is absolutely wild, and we're going to talk about some best case uses for that when we talk about the different deployment stuff, when we pull up the deployment maps and we break that down. We'll talk about when you want to make sure that you have the command points for Apoplectic Frenzy. So that more or less covers off the detachment. So we talked about the enhancements, we talked about the detachment rule, and we talked about all of the different stratagems. So there's some pretty crazy stuff in there, and yeah, let's jump on to the next section. Alrighty guys, if you've been enjoying this content so far and you would like to show your support, you can join our Patreon, which is a place where you can get one-on-one coaching, and I can adapt this specific type of content to your specific needs. And we also have an exclusive Discord server where we talk things, we talk hobby, we talk recent events, we talk all types of list ideas, we talk strategy in there. It's a great little community of like-minded World Eaters and Chaos Space Marine players typically, but lots of chaotic goodness in that private Discord that's accessible via our Patreon subscription. So if you want to show your support and allow me to continue producing content like this, getting bigger and better every time, and making sure that that content is readily available to you, then join our Patreon. It's a great way to show your support, and I very much appreciate all of those who are supporting me on Patreon. So with that being said, let's just jump straight back into the video. Alrighty guys, let's talk about all the different data sheets and the units that are available to World Eaters players. What we're going to do here is an overview of every unit, but a few of them we're going to deep dive in and point out some of the more interesting parts about these units. So let's take a look at the big bad Angron himself first. So this bloke is absolutely brutal. He's got a huge movement characteristic which leans into World Eater's strength. He's tough, he's got a 2-up save, he's got a 4-up invulnerable save, he's got 16 wounds, so he's really, really tough. His melee weapons are absolutely brutal. And one of the things you'll note with World Eaters is a lot of their stuff, even the Exalted 8-bound and the Terminators, are all damage 2. So one of the things World Eaters are susceptible to is neg 1 damage. That's really, really bad for the World Eaters. So Angron is a really good way of getting around that. He's really good because he just goes in with his D6 plus 2 strikes, and he just eviscerates anything he touches. So Angron's really good in that regard. He also has some really interesting abilities. So he's got the Reborn in Blood, which we discussed earlier, which is when you're making your Blessings roll. If you happen to roll 666, boom, you get Angron back, which can absolutely flip those games where you feel like you're losing. One of the things worth noting here is that you either, in my opinion, you want to play Angron super conservative and not throw him away easily, and basically lean on the fact that he's super durable to put him in areas of the board where your opponent doesn't have sufficient response to kill him, And that way you're going to keep Angron alive for a very long time. And anything that he does touch, he's going to destroy. So he allows you to lock down one corner of the board really effectively. The other way to play Angron, which is equally viable, is to just turn one, full send, launch him straight into your opponent, kill something, trust that your opponent's going to turn their entire army on him and kill him. But if they do that, they're not killing everything else in your army, and then there's every chance that you're going to resurrect him anyway, and their first turn is going to be futile. So that's really, really powerful as well. So there's two different ways that you can play Angron, and one of them is facilitated by Born in Blood. The other thing that he has is Wrathful Presence, which is going to allow you at the start of the charge phase to select one ability from the below list and apply that. So Wrathful Presence is going to let you use, Glorious Bloodletting, which is basically add one to the charge rolls for friendly units within 6 inches. This is really fantastic if he does get resurrected and he comes back in from Deep Strike, because now he's got an 8-inch charge because he's a beneficiary of his own aura. But also any 8-bound that you might be bringing in, or any berserkers that are going for long charges, they also benefit from this. So this is really, really good. The other one that he has is Infectious Rage, which is a 6-inch aura, and basically you add one to the attack's characteristic of models in that nearby units if they're below starting strength, and this one's bad. So the reason that I slowed down there is because I've read this once and immediately discarded it, because it's significantly worse than the next one, which applies effectively the same thing but better. So you're never going to use Infectious Rage. What you're going to use is Righteous Slaughter, which is basically any enemy friendly units within 6 inches get reroll hits. Now the reason this is because adding one to your attack's characteristic is nowhere near as good as rerolling hits. Because if you think about it, say you've got 6 attacks, if you add one and you're hitting on, say, a 3+, you're going to get an average of like 5 hits, because you get the +1 and then you're probably going to miss 2. Whereas if you get the reroll hits and you have 6 attacks and you're hitting on 3s, you're still probably going to get 5 hits, because of those 5 attacks you're probably going to miss 1 or 2, but then you're going to reroll those and get those additional hits back in. So mathematically it works out that you're always better rerolling your hits than you are getting +1 attack. And on top of that, when you're rerolling hits, if you have the sustained hits or the lethal hits active, it doubles your chances of rolling a 6 on that hit roll. So completely forget about Infectious Rage. You're always going to use Righteous Slaughter. What I generally do is I tell my opponent at the start of the game, unless I say otherwise, I'm always going to use Righteous Slaughter on Angron, because that's the default. And then the only time that you would change that is if you're going for a long bomb charge, where you go, actually, this time, at the start of the charge phase, you've measured it out and you know you're a decent distance away, you're going to be like, I'm going to go with the +1 to charge instead. But the default should always be the Righteous Slaughter. Then he's got a few other things like Wrathful Supreme Commander. He has to be the, the Warlord if you have one. And then also, interestingly, he has the Fly keyword. Now, Fly is an amazingly powerful keyword, and he is the only thing in the World Eaters that realistically has access to it, which one of the weaknesses of the World Eaters is your opponent can do things like put units in your way so that your 8-bound can't charge that tank because it's got to get through the guardsman at the front. Angron mitigates that because he just jumps over the guardsman, doesn't care. So that's Angron. He's an absolute staple, I think, for his points and what he provides to the army, in the way that he is a solo beat stick that's really tough and provides an aura and can be resurrected. There's nothing not to love about Angron. He's fantastic. Alright, next we're going to talk about the various 8-bound units. So we've got regular 8-bound and exalted 8-bound. Now, the regular 8-bound, one of the things that's worth noting on them is that their melee is not that powerful. Like, they've only got like strength 5, so strength 6 on the charge, AP 2 damage. So, but they do have a lot of attacks. So they're got a high volume of attacks, which means you get additional chances for your lethals and your sustained, which is fantastic. And if you're rerolling from Angron, that's a boatload of attacks there. Interestingly, they have the capacity to give the leader of the unit, the squad sergeant, lacerators. Now, this is easily the best option. The other option for them is the heavy chain glaive. But the lacerators means you're going to go with 5 attacks, hitting on 3s, but they're going to be strength 10 because you get +1 strength on the charge, AP 2, and 3 damage. Now, that 3 damage is really important because, like I said earlier, there's a lot of things where being neg-1 damage really hurts, and there's also a lot of 3 wound models out there. There's Terminators, there's things like 8-bound, there's things like Aggressors, there's all sorts of things that have 3 wounds. And if you're only hitting them with 2 damage attacks, it requires 2 hits to kill them. Whereas if you're able to go in there with the Lacerator guy, 3 damage attacks, you're going to be cleaving through Chaos Space Marine Chosen with ease. You're going to be cleaving through all sorts of things. So 3 damage is a really, really useful break point, and the 8-bound are one of the few ways to get access to it. So that's definitely one you want to take. Interestingly, their abilities, they have inbuilt Scout 6 inches. So we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about Lord Invicardus, but it's worth noting that the 8-bound just have this built in. So before the game starts, you're going to be able to move them 6 inches. And then, like we said with the Blessings, you can then get +2 to their movement characteristic, which is going to allow you to move an additional 2. So now you've moved 8 inches. Then they have a 9-inch move characteristic, so now you're moving an additional 9, so that's 17 inches. Then you can advance if you roll the advance and charge, and you can spend a CP to make that an auto 6. So you're going 23 inches out of your deployment zone turn 1, and then you're rolling 2d6 for your charge rolls. So these guys have the absolute best Alpha Strike melee potential in the game. They can charge things in your opponent's backfield, no worries. It's not something you're always going to want to do, and we will talk about that when we break down deployment. We'll talk about when to go aggressive and what to do with those sorts of things, but it's worth noting that you do have the option to go hyper aggressive and do serious damage in that first turn. The other thing that they have is Beacons of Rage, which is an aura of 6 inches, which basically allows friendly units to reroll 1s to their wound rolls, and if the target's below half strength, you get to reroll all your wounds. This is phenomenal on things like Berserkers, even things like Angron. He's going to be wounding a lot of things on 2s, but if you allow him to reroll 1s to wound, now you allow Angron to split his attacks across multiple targets and reliably kill several things. So that's really, really wild. This aura is a fantastic one. And if you're going up against something really, really tough, like say they've got a big unit of Terminators or something, once you finally chip it down to below half strength and then you throw in a unit of Berserkers or something and they get full rerolls to wound, they're going to do impossible amounts of damage compared to what they would originally have done without the 8-bound nearby. It's also really good on the 8-bound themselves because they're affected by their own aura. So this unit is a little bit more reliable than what you would initially think because they're going in with those rerolls. So 8-bound are absolutely fantastic. I'm a big fan of just the regular 8-bound. Let's talk about Exalted 8-bound now. So they've got slightly different melee weapon options. So basically your squad leader can take the heavy chain glaive as well, or he can take the paired 8-bound chain fist, which is definitely the stronger option. And then every other 8-bound in the squad is going to get a single 8-bound chain fist and a single eviscerator. Now it's worth noting with these guys that the eviscerators that they have hit on 2s as opposed to the regular 8-bound that hit on 3s. These are also strength 6, so going to go up to strength 7 on the charge. And there's 5 attacks instead of the 6. So you're going to go in with 6 attacks instead of 7 because of the +1 from your detachment rule. So these guys are a slightly different profile, even though the wording of the weapon is the same, right? Then you've also got the 8-bound chain fist, which is going to be from 4 attacks on the charge. They're hitting on 3s. They're going to be strength 15 on the charge. So there's not much that they don't wound on 2 or 3. And then they're AP 3, 2 damage. So these guys are fantastic. These are one of the strongest units, and there's a reason that they've received several nerfs, because they are very, very strong. But a lot of their strength actually comes from a pretty wild ability that they have. So they've got Deep Strike, which is really, really relevant for rapid ingress, which is a stratagem that you're going to want to use on these guys regularly. They also have 6-up Feel No Pain inbuilt, which means when you use your Blessings of Khorne roll to get a 6-up Feel No Pain, these guys are going to get a 5-up Feel No Pain. And when you're toughness 6 with 3 wounds and a 5-up Feel No Pain, there's not many damage profiles that are effective into that. So that's really, really cool. But their datasheet ability is Overwhelming Wrath, which basically means each time an enemy unit within 6 inches of this unit attempts to fall back, they have to take a leadership test, and if they fail that, they must remain stationary instead. So it's worth noting that this isn't just units within engagement range of the 8-bound. So they could charge something and fail to kill it. Not only does that unit have to take a leadership test if it wants to fall back, but any units within 6 inches. So what you can do is you can throw one of these down the center, kill something, pile into something else, then Angron can go down one of the flanks, kill something, and then pile in to something else nearby to the 8-bound. And then maybe some Berserkers or some regular 8-bound or a Mauler Fiend or something does the same thing on the other flank. And basically, if your opponent is clustered up where they've got multiple units within 6 inches of each other, and you've tagged them all of them have to take leadership checks. Otherwise, they cannot successfully fall back. And this is wild, because if they fail to fall back, that means that they're not going to be able to effectively shoot the 8-bound or Berserkers or whatever it is that you have an engagement range of them, which means they're going to have to charge you, which is exactly where you want them. I find this pairs particularly well with berserkers that are led by a Master of Executions, because that Master of Executions provides fights first, so they can't shoot you because you're in engagement range of them, and if they charge you, you're going to fight first, and you're going to kill whatever just charged before it strikes. So it creates really, really hard to solve problems when you've got the berserkers and the Exalted 8-bound nearby. It's worth noting this is one of the units that you can take as either 3 or 6, and there's pros and cons to both. If you want to do more of an MSU trading style army where you've got lots and lots of units, then you want to take multiple units of 3, whereas if you want to go something with a little bit more chunk to it and a little bit more meat on the bones, you're going to want to take a unit of 6. So we'll break that down when we talk about some of the example lists later in the video. You've also got Jackals here. Now, Jackals aren't particularly exciting. They're a 65-point screening unit. They're they hit relatively hard. Like they'll kill 5 Marines if they're near Angron for the rerolls. They'll kill small things like a unit of Scouts or something like that relatively effectively. And they're surprisingly durable because they have a 6-up Feel No Pain inbuilt, and that gives them that extra durability. And when you combine that with your blessings and you get the 5-up Feel No Pain, if you're out of line of sight, so you're in cover somewhere, it's very hard for your opponent to kill these Jackals. They're surprisingly tough, and when they do get those buffs from Angron, etc., they hit quite hard. I recommend taking, on your Dishonored, I recommend taking the Skull Smasher. I find that the most effective, and then you're definitely going to want to take one of those Mauler Chainblades, which means that this unit of quote-unquote cultists actually has 2 models inside of it that have AP1 2 damage attacks. So they actually can chunk through things like your standard Tactical Marines or your Tactical Marine equivalent with relative ease. So very effective unit. I think they're costed very, very competitively. But one of the things that makes them the most interesting is their unique datasheet ability, which is Objective Ravaged, which basically means that at the start of the command phase, if this unit was controlling an objective, that objective will remain under your control until your opponent takes it off you at some stage. So these guys, they start on your home objective, and basically when your whole army pushes out, these guys can also push out and leave your home behind, and you still score those victory points for holding it, even though your units are not on it. So really, really powerful. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is it allows you to stick your home objective and then push out. So you can still stay in your home, you can still stay in your backline, but if you've got 2 units of Jackals on your home, you can then fan them out like that so that they're around your home. They're not still on it, but they're around it. And that means your opponent can't deep strike onto it. They can't flank you and get onto it. If they draw a card like Storm Hostile Objective or something like that, they're not going to get it off you, even though you control the objective, because there's no unit on it. If they get Overwhelming Force and kill enemy units off of objectives, well, you're able to simultaneously score victory points because you count as controlling the objective whilst not being on the objective. So that gives you a lot of interplay with the missions and allows you to interact with your opponent in some really interesting ways. So I think 1 or 2 units of Jackals is absolutely mandatory, but we'll go through that in detail when we break down some different list examples. We've got Khorne the Betrayer. Now, he's really, really powerful. He's got, in his melee, he's got 8 attacks, so he's going to get 9 attacks on the charge, hitting on 2s, strength 6, AP2, 3 damage, and like we discussed with the 8-bound, that 3 damage is really, really good. He has a really interesting ability where basically, if he's leading a unit, that unit gets to reroll 1s to hit and wound, which means if you do put him in a unit of Berserkers, they don't necessarily require Angron or any 8-bound to get high efficiency because they're rerolling their 1s to hit and to wound. So you can send a unit with Khorne in one direction and Angron and your 8-bound in another direction, and that unit with Khorne can be relatively reliable on its own. However, you've got to be careful because he has an ability called the Betray, which is basically at the end of your charge phase, if you're leading a unit that's not within engagement range, you have to take a battle shock test, and if that battle shock test is failed, one of the bodyguard units is destroyed. So if you've got Khorne sitting on an objective somewhere and he's not engaged in combat with your enemy models, there's every chance that he's going to slowly chew through that unit. So basically, if you're taking Khorne, you either want to run him on his own, or you want to run him in a unit and make sure that he's in the thick of things. I like to run him on his own. I think he's one of those really, really important trading pieces in the army. He's only 100 points, he's got relatively high damage output, and his next ability is the thing that makes me prefer running him on his own, which is that when he's destroyed by a melee attack, if he has not fought yet this phase, he can fight. So basically, he fights on death automatically. Doesn't need to roll for it like everything else in the army when you use the blessings. And what you can do with him is you can throw him out. Let's say your opponent turn 1 puts some scouts on an objective marker, right? You can throw Khorne out, kill those scouts, right? and now Khan's sitting on the objective marker on his own. Now, if your opponent moves a tank around or something like that and shoots Khan, you're like, cool, I'm going to spend 1 command point to drown that objective in blood, and now that objective remains under my control, even though you've killed me off of it, right? So they're like, okay, well, I have to get on the objective then. So if they throw a unit and charge Khan and kill Khan, well, Khan's going to fight on death and kill the unit that just killed him anyway. So it puts your opponent in a real tricky spot. And for 100 points, that's a really powerful ability to have in your army. He also allows you to do things like, let's say you're versing another World Eaters player. You can go, cool, I'm going to charge my Berserkers into your Exalted 8-bound and Khan into your regular 8-bound. I'm going to fight first with these Berserkers and kill your Exalted 8-bound. And now if your opponent spends 2 command points to counter-offensive and interrupt the combat sequence and fight and kill Khan, well, he's going to fight on death and kill those 8-bound anyway. So it allows you to secure multiple kills in a game where often trying to get multiple kills is risky because your opponent can interrupt and throw that sequencing out. So Khan's a really interesting tech piece that allows you to get around those sorts of things. And being only 100 points, it actually doesn't matter if he doesn't do any of that. Like if you take Khan on his own, and maybe your opponent's got a bunch of indirects, so you want to make sure he's safe, so you put him in strategic reserves, and you draw behind enemy lines as a card, so in turn 3, so he comes on from strat reserves in your opponent's deployment zone, he gets you your victory points for that, and then hypothetically he fails his charge, and then dies to shooting, and he's not on an objective, right? That's the worst case scenario for Khorne. And even that's pretty good. Like, it was a 100-point unit, he got you some victory points, and he took some firepower away from your stuff that was on objectives. You're relatively happy with that. So Khorne the Betrayer, absolutely S tier. I think he's fantastic. Now we've got Khorne Berserkers, so their melee weapons are actually somewhat unimpressive. However, like we said with the various stratagems and blessings, you can dial their damage up. When you're re-rolling hits and you're getting lethal hits, all of a sudden their low strength 6 doesn't really matter that much. When you're getting sustained hits, you know, you're able to put a lot of damage out there, and the Eviscerators do pretty good work. One of the things that makes them the most interesting is that they have a really high volume of attacks. Like if you take a unit of 10 and they're getting 5 attacks each, that's essentially 50 attacks. A few less because the Eviscerators get less attacks, but you know, roughly 50 attacks coming out of that unit. And that's going to absolutely mince things that are neg-1 damage, because it's a whole ton of 1 damage attacks. You don't care about their damage reduction, and you're able to just go in and just bulk wounds on them. Things like Orc Boys as well, where they're like, we got really good saves, we got really, you know, this, that, and whatever. Feel no pains, you're just like, I don't care, have a billion, you know, hits. So that's really effective. But where the Berserkers come into play most, in my opinion, is this Blood Surge ability. So basically, the way that the Blood Surge works is when your opponent shoots at you, if they removed a casualty, after they've finished making their attacks, you can roll a d6 and move that many inches, and the unit must end as close as possible to enemy units. So we'll break this down in detail when we put some practical examples out on how you can get the most out of this, but essentially, you can use that to end within engagement range of your opponent. So you can throw a big unit of Berserkers on an objective, and your opponent, if they shoot you and just wipe you out, you can sticky the objective. If they charge you, you're going to fight first, and if they get close to you and shoot you, you're going to Blood Surge into them and kill them. So that one unit of Berserkers creates a real interesting problem that's really, really hard for some armies to answer. So that's all facilitated in part by the Blood Surge move. And they also are the recipients of the leaders like Khorne and the Master of Executions. So there's a lot of value there as well. Now let's talk about the Khorne Lord of Skulls. This thing is phenomenal. It's really tough, so it's got a toughness characteristic of 13, which is pretty wild. 24 wounds, and when you put a 6 up Feel No Pain on that, it's effectively 30 wounds, because you're likely to pass a bunch of those 6s. It's got a 5 up Invulnerable Save as well, so this thing's just really hard to kill. Las Cannons and Multi-Melters are all wounding it on 5s. Like, it's very hard to put damage into this thing. And then it has a bunch of different ranged weapon options. Now, all of these are good. However, I think the standouts for me are the Demon Gore Cannon, because you're strength 14, AP 4, D6 plus 2 damage. So you're actually putting out serious damage into things that you're targeting. And you are D6 shots with blast. So it's not very low volume. The downside to this, of course, is that it's only 18 inches range, whereas the other weapons are a bit longer range. But I still recommend the Demon Gore Cannon. And then the other options are the Gore Storm or the Ico Cannon for that arm. And then the other weapon that you have available to you is the Hades Gatling Cannon or the Skull Hurler. Now, again, I like the Skull Hurler here because it's got 2d6 shots as opposed to 12, so it's fewer shots. You're going to get an average of 7 instead of 12. However, it's strength 14, AP 3, 3 damage, and it's 60 inches range. So that Skull Hurler is absolutely fantastic weapon. And these two things combined, just in shooting, are going to likely kill, a small to medium target. Interestingly, melee weapons, no surprises here. It's an absolute monster in melee. It's got either 6 attacks at strength 17, AP 4, 8 flat damage. So this thing is going to chunk vehicles like it's nobody's business. And it also has 16 attacks with its sweep mode, which are going to be strength 9, because you get +1, and also AP 2, 2 damage. So depending on what you're into, you've got the ability to either just do big 8 damage hits, or you can sweep for 2 damage. So it's really hard to pin this thing down and sandbag it, or tarp hit it. But yeah, really, really powerful melee, really, really powerful shooting, really, really tough. And interestingly, it's got one really wild ability. So first of all, its deadly demise is D6 + 2, which is pretty wild. If it does explode, it's going to rip apart anything. So you want to throw this into the center of your opponent's lines so that when they do kill it, if they manage to kill it, which is already a big if, you're going to be potentially doing D6 + 2 mortal wounds to everything nearby, which is wild. But further to that, each time you make a Blessings of Khorne roll, for each enemy unit that was destroyed in the last battle round by this Lord of Skulls, you get to modify the result of one of your dice by 1. So you can either increase or decrease it. So that's really good when you're looking for that advance and charge, right? Now, instead of needing to roll, 3 4-ups or 2 6s, you're able to go, oh cool, I rolled a 6 and a 5, but the Lord of Skulls killed something last battle round, so I'm going to turn that 5 into a 6, and now I've got my double 6s required to get advance and charge. Or if you want triple 4s, and you go, cool, I rolled 2 4s and a 5, well, I'm going to use the Lord of Skulls to turn that 5 down into a 4, which means I have triple 4, which is going to let me get my advance and charge. This also goes a massive way towards improving your probability of resurrecting Angron. So if you have a Lord of Skulls in your list, you want to play way more aggressively with Angron, because the chances of you getting those triple 6s is almost double when you're able to manipulate 1 or 2 of those dice. So if you have those and a bunch of Jackals on objective markers, maybe you have the favorite of Khorne Enhancement, all of a sudden the probability of getting Angron back is really, really high. Whereas if you don't have any of those things, it's really, really low. So depending on the type of list, and we'll talk about that when we break down the list types later in the video, but a Khorne Lord of Skulls with this ability is absolutely fantastic. Alright, next unit is the Lord of Icardus. Now this guy's a competitive staple. You'll see him in almost every competitive list. He's pretty tough. He's got toughness 6 with 8 wounds. He's got a 2-up armor save and a 4-up invulnerable save, so he's relatively tough. His melee weapons are somewhat lackluster. He's got 7, so 8 attacks on the charge, hitting on 2s, strength 6, AP 2, 2 damage with dev wounds. And then he's also got an additional 4 attacks from his Juggernaut, which are hitting on 3s, strength 6, AP 1, 2 damage with Lance. But on average, if he charges a unit of 5 tactical marines, he probably kills 3 or 4. Particularly if they use something like Armor of Contempt or various stratagems to reduce the damage of you. He's not reliably going to be killing things, and he is 140 points. So being tough and not reliably killing things for 140 points isn't fantastic, but what he does do is he has a 12-inch move, and in his abilities, he has the 6-inch scout. So he automatically can 6-inch scout and then move 12. So he's moving 18 inches in that first turn, and then potentially charging from there. If you get an advance and charge, you could auto 6 that advance. You can move him 24 inches and then charge something, which 24 inches on most maps, it's going to get you into your opponent's deployment zone. So that's really, really fast. It also allows you to get things like behind enemy lines on that first turn if you do draw it. Really, really effective. But interestingly, he also has 2 datasheet abilities. And one of them is called Counterattacks, where basically if he's leading a unit, he's able to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which he fell back. This is not particularly interesting because once you add a 140 point unit to a character to a unit, now you're talking a really, really expensive unit, and I don't think this provides enough utility to justify that. I think this guy is much better served as a lone character running around. Yes, he doesn't have lone ops, so people can shoot him, but like I said, he's relatively tough, and the main thing you want him for in your competitive list is this next ability called Road of 8 Bloody Steps. And basically this is going to allow you to select 2 units from your army that are on the battlefield within 6 inches of him during deployment, and then you can scout move those 2 units as well. So he scouts and those 2 units scout, and all of your regular 8-bound scout. So you're able to have an army that deploys 6. Your deployment zone is essentially 6 inches bigger than your opponent's, which is going to give you ability to get into little nooks, get into hiding spots, and really effectively play that sort of staging game where you've deployed somewhere safe. Your opponent can't shoot you in the first turn. They're not likely to want to charge you, and you're set up ready to do massive attacks onto them. And Lord Incarnatus enables that. So that's the main utility you'll see from him, is that people take him for that scout move and the fact that he's able to move super fast himself. Next, we've got the Chaos Spawn. Now, these guys are quite interesting. So they're 65 points, relatively cheap, 8-inch move, toughness 5, 4-up save, 4 wounds. Their melee weapons aren't particularly interesting. You know, d6 plus 2, so it'll be d6 plus 3 on the turn you charge. Hitting on 4s, strength 6, AP 1, 2 damage. Again, these guys hit roughly the same as Lord Incarnatus and roughly the same as a unit of Jackals. You know, they'll bully small things. You know, they'll kill 5 Zephyrim or whatever's dropped in your backfield, but they're not going to kill anything substantial. What they do have that's really interesting is a couple of abilities. One of them is a 5-up Feel No Pain, which means when you're using the Blessings of Khorne, you can make this a 4-up Feel No Pain. So now, if this unit's in cover, we're talking about a unit that's going to have a 3-up saving throw with a 4-up Feel No Pain and a ton of wounds. So really, really tough. But further to that, at the start of each player's command phase, each model in this unit regains up to D3 wounds. So when they're going in and they're starting with their 4 wounds, if your opponent puts a bunch of shooting into and kills you down to 3, in your command phase, you regenerate D3, and then in your opponent's command phase, you regenerate another D3. So they're going to have to do that all again. And chances are, the thing that just hit you, you've responded to. Really, really powerful ability on these guys. They're just a really cheap, tough, and relatively fast unit that's great for bullying small things and objectives. Like if you need to cleanse an objective, if you need to get, secure no man's land, if you want to get area denial, Chaos Spawn are a really cheap and effective way of going out and doing that. Especially if you want to use the Auto 6 advance on them, you can move these guys 14 inches in a turn. So if you need to be out on that objective, well, these guys are able to go from that safe spot in your deployment zone all the way out onto that midfield objective with ease, really. So the Chaos Spawn are really good. The 2 Demon Princes, I'm not going to open their data sheets because they're not particularly interesting. As far as I'm concerned, they're way too expensive. They don't really provide any meaningful auras. The Demon Prince on foot does provide a 5-up invulnerable save to things like Berserkers and Jackals, or a 4-up invulnerable save to things like your 8-bound, but for his points, you're better off just bringing more 8-bound, because then you're increasing the durability of your 8-bound by doubling the amount you have, and you're also having the damage capacity of the 8-bound, which is greater than the damage capacity of the Demon Prince. So, as far as I'm concerned, you're never taking Demon Princes, unless you're particularly skewing your list around big tough things, because they are 2-up saves with lots of wounds and 4-up invulnerable saves, so they're relatively tough, but personally I don't think you're going to want to be doing that. The Defiler, similar story, we're not going to open that one because it's not particularly interesting. It doesn't provide any interesting auras, it's quite expensive. It does a little bit of shooting, which is something that the World Eaters lack, but generally speaking, I think you're better off using things like the Forge Fiends for your shooting, as opposed to things like the Defiler. Let's talk about the Forge Fiend, though. So this guy is, toughness 10, 12 wounds. He's got a 5-up invulnerable save, so he's relatively tough. He's not super easy, especially if you put the 6-up Feel No Pain on him as well. But what's interesting is you can give him 3 of these Ectoplasma Cannons, which means he's going to get 3 D3 blasts. So Chaos Space Marine players know and love this guy. He's a little bit less interesting in ours because he doesn't get the sustained hits from his shooting, and he doesn't have the devastating wounds from his Pacts of Flesh, or whatever it's called. But he's still putting out a decent amount of Strength 10, AP 3 damage shots. So really, really effective there. His melee weapons are irrelevant, but what he does have, which is a really interesting ability, is Furious Onslaught. And basically, in your shooting phase, after he's finished making attacks, if one or more enemy units, one or more attacks scored hits against an enemy infantry unit, that enemy infantry unit must take a battle shock test. So you can move this guy out and you can shoot into 3 things, and then all 3 of those things are going to have to take a battle shock test. Now, the reason this is relevant is because you're doing this in the shooting phase. So if you're about to charge something and you're worried that they're going to spend command points to interrupt, what you can do is you can shoot multiple units, and whichever one fails their battle shock test can't interrupt. So then you charge that unit and another unit, fight the other unit first, and then they can't interrupt with this unit because it's battle shock, and then you get to fight it as well. This also means that they can't turn on things like Armor of Contempt. They can't turn on neg-1 damage if they have access to it. There's lots of things that are really, really good with this guy. So not only is he a relatively tough unit that can contribute shooting damage, which is something world leaders struggle with, but also he has the ability to battle shock enemy units, which is something that can be massively advantageous in a combat matchup. So I really like the Forge Fiend. He's relatively cheap as well. Like, he's only 145 points. So he's really effective. The one argument that we will have against him is that he's going in with 3d3, so roughly like 6 or 7 shots, depending on if there's, blast opportunities or whatever, that are 3 damage. If you take a unit of regular 8-bound, which is the same points as him, 145, you're going to have the Sergeant, which is going to go in with roughly the same number of 3 damage attacks. But he also brings 2 boys with him as well, and because that's a combat unit that's infantry, if your opponent's hiding behind a wall or something, the 8-bound don't care. The 8-bound can just charge through. Whereas the Forge Fiend, it needs to be able to see its target. So there's a weakness to the Forge Fiend in that regard, but there's some advantages in the way that if you're worried about your opponent interrupting, well, they can't interrupt your shooting, you just shoot them dead. It also allows you to soften things up, take the battle shock, so there's a lot of things to be considered with the Forge Fiend, and I think it's a very viable unit in a competitive list. The Hellbrute, this has got a pretty interesting ability as well. I think when you take an Hellbrute, you're going to want to give him 2 Hellbrute Fists and put Heavy Flamers in each, and that allows you to activate his abilities. One of them is the Hellbrute Fists ability, which basically means if you have 2, they gain Twin Link. So now he's going in with a bunch of attacks. With his fist, he's got 5 attacks, so 6 on the charge, hitting on 3s, strength 12, AP 2, 3 damage, which again, we're talking about 3 damage weapons being really, really effective, and he's rerolling his wounds. So with strength 12, he's going to be winning a lot of things on 2s with rerolls. Vehicles, he's going to be winning on 3s with rerolls. Very, very effective at dealing with those sorts of things. But his Frenzy rule is a really crazy rule, where basically each time an enemy unit targets this model, after that enemy unit has finished making its attacks, you can either shoot as if it was the shooting phase or fight as if it was the fight phase. So if you've got those 2 flamers inside your fists and you're on an objective and your opponent moves up onto the objective and they shoot you, you can go, cool, Vushka, I'm going to flamer that unit that was trying to take this objective from me. So that is a really interesting dynamic. But the really interesting thing about this is that in combat, if you charge them and you fight and don't kill the target, they hit you back, and then you get to fight again, which kills them, right? And then, if you are nearby an enemy unit, you can consolidate into them and then fight them again. So I'll break down how that works with some specific examples when we get models out later, but just know that that Hellbrute is wild. He's a really effective unit. And he's pretty cheap, only 130 points. The Helldrake is completely rubbish. Don't even look at it at all. The Land Raider, I'm not going to open its data sheet. We all know what Land Raiders do. The thing about the World Leaders Land Raider is it does have the capacity to auto-advance 6 inches, which is kind of cool. You can disembark after the unit makes a normal move, which means anybody who has reactive moves, you can end the Land Raider's move just outside of 9 inches and then disembark. So now you're 6 inches away from the target and they can't reactive move because that disembark doesn't count. So that's really effective. It's also really tough. It can hold 8-bound inside of it. So one thing that you can do is you can deploy the Land Raider somewhere hidden out of line of sight if you're worried about your opponent indirecting you or something like that. And then you can basically deploy your 8-bound on the line, and if your opponent goes first and they're going to shoot your 8-bound, you can scout move back into the Land Raider, and now they can't shoot you. So there's a few really interesting things you can do with the Land Raider in a World Leaders list specifically, but generally speaking, it's a bit of a gunboat, it's kind of tough, it's a nice big chunky unit. The World Eater's Lord on Juggernaut. So this lad, he's got some interesting stuff. One of his abilities is that he does mortal wounds on the charge, and he also allows the unit he's attached to, if you attach him to Berserkers, to reroll advances, charge rolls, and blood surge rolls. Now, the blood surge rolls rerolling is really interesting. He also has a 12-inch move, so if you attach him to a unit of Berserkers that has a 6-inch move, he can move out extra far, and then the Berserkers can string back to him. And then when he makes a charge move, you can slingshot the Berserkers in. So we'll talk about that when we get models out, but just know that the Lord on Juggernaut is actually quite good. He's only 100 points, he's relatively tough. You know, his damage output's not amazing because his Exalted Chainblade is only AP 1 and the Juggernaut Horn is only AP 1. So if you're going into somebody who has access to Armor of Contempt, he's not going to do a massive amount of damage. But he does some interesting things for the Khorne Berserkers. Next, we have one of my favorite units in the index, which is the Master of Executions. Now, this guy, he's relatively weak. He's only got 4 wounds and no invulnerable save, so he's very easy to kill. However, in melee, he's got a pretty wild weapon, particularly when paired with the Berserker's Glaive. He's got 6 attacks, hitting on 2s, strength 8, AP2, 2 damage, with devastating wounds and precision. So he's got quite a hefty blow there. And he's got 2 really wild datasheet abilities. One of them is that while he's leading a unit, that unit gains fights first, which is fantastic on Khorne Berserkers, because now if somebody charges you, like we discussed earlier, you're just going to eviscerate them before they fight. So that's really, really effective. And then also he has Murderous Swing, which is each time he targets an enemy character unit, he, the bearer, gains reroll hit rolls and reroll wound rolls. So with that devastating wound weapon, you're now rerolling your wounds, doubling your chances of getting that devastating wound. And if you have the Berserker Glaive, giving him 3 damage attacks, each time you roll a 6 to wound, that's just 3 wounds taken out of your opponent. And because it's character unit, you don't even necessarily have to precision to get it. So you could charge a unit of Terminators, and then just go, cool, I'm just going to strike against the Terminators. But because there's a character attached to that unit, I'm getting my rerolls to hit and wound with this character, with 3 damage attacks and devastating wounds. He's going to kill like 4 Terminators, 5 Terminators on his own. And then the Berserkers are going to pick up the rest. So that's really, really effective. The other way that you can run this guy is running him on his own and allowing him to basically, he can charge a unit and then maybe Khorne and Berserkers charge the unit, right? And then he has free precision, so he precisions and takes out any enemy characters that are providing a relevant defensive buff to that unit. And then when the Berserkers go to activate, that unit that you've just targeted no longer has that defensive buff. So an example could be like a Necron unit with Wraiths that have that little character in it. He jumps in, he targets him, he gets his reroll hits and wounds against him, he precisions out, and he kills that Cryptek or whatever. And now those Wraiths will not get their Fear No Pain saves when Khorne and the Berserkers go in with their reroll 1s to hit and wound, and they do massive damage. So he can combo quite well. And one of the things that I like about it is you can often take Khorne and a Master of Executions in your list, and then at the start of the game, when depending on who you're versing, you decide who goes with the Berserkers. Do I want to put Khorne with the Berserkers and have the Master of Executions as my solo assassin? Or do I want to put the Master of Executions with the Berserkers so that I have a big fights first brick, and then Khorne operates in that solo assassin mode? So there's a few different ways that you can run it, and all of them are fantastic. Another really cool thing is this guy is obviously the recipient of a lot of your enhancements, and if you put the Heroic Intervention one on him, now you've got a unit that fights first and heroically intervenes, which is one of the most powerful combos of rules that you can have in a combat army. So we'll break some of that stuff down later, but let's keep going through these units because there's still a few to cover. The Mauler Fiend, this is absolutely fantastic. He just got a massive glow up with some new points costs. You can give him the Mauler Fiend Fist, so he's got 7 attacks, hitting on 3s, strength 14, AP2, D6, plus 1 damage. So he's able to really hurt things. But interestingly, with that strength 14, that means when you tank shock with this guy, you're going to be rolling on average 16 dice, because most of the time you're going to be tough, stronger than they are tough, unless you find something that's toughness 14. But he's going to be rolling 16 dice, and every 5 up is going to be a mortal wound. So this guy's a very reliable way of using the tank shock stratagem to do 6 mortal wounds in the charge phase, which is pretty wild into certain things. And it pairs quite well with his abilities, which is the Scent of Blood, which is each time you make a charge roll for this model, if one or more of the targets of that charge roll are below starting strength, you add 2 to your charge rolls. And then in the fight phase, each time you make an attack, if the target of that attack is below starting strength, you add 1 to the hit roll. So now this guy can go into something like Magnus, for example. He can go to charge, he can tank shock them, which means he's going to do 6 mortal wounds to Magnus. Then when he fights, he's now hitting on 2 with those power fists. And he's probably just going to charge in and kill Magnus. You can also do some really interesting stuff where you can rapid ingress him, move him up, then shoot a Forge Fiend at something. You know, you split the Forge Fiend's guns, you put 3 guns into different things. If that Forge Fiend does 1 wound to the target, now that Mauler Fiend that's just came in from rapid ingress or from strategic reserves, it's getting +2 to its charges, which is pretty wild as well. So there's some really interesting stuff you can do with the Mauler Fiend, and it's got a 10-inch movement, right? So you can go 10 inches, you can get +2 from your blessings, so now you're moving 12. Then you can auto-advance 6, so you're going 18 inches and then charging. This thing is wild. It's so fast. The weaknesses to the Mauler Fiend are that it can't move through walls, of course. So if your opponent's staged behind a wall, you're going to have to go all the way around to get them. Whereas something like 8-bound can just go straight through the wall. So there's some weaknesses to it, but there's definitely some strengths. I'm a huge fan of Mauler Fiends. Then we got the two Predators. Again, I'm not going to go into these guys. We all know what Predators do. I think they're particularly uninteresting in the World Eaters because they don't really benefit from any of your army rules. They get the 6-up Feel No Pain, which is kind of nice, makes them relatively tough. But for 130 points, something that just puts down a couple of las cannons downrange, you're better off with a unit of 8 bound for a little bit extra points, but it's a piece that's going to do significantly more damage. It's able to hide, it's able to do all kinds of things that the Predators can't do. So, Predators relatively uninteresting. The Rhino. Now, the Rhino, there's nothing about the Rhino that's unique in a World Eaters list, but what the Rhino does is it obviously transports things like Berserkers, which is going to increase the movement of the Berserkers. Not only can you move the Rhino, and then disembark if you need to get onto an objective or something like that, but if you have that Rhino hidden out of line of sight on a ruin somewhere, those Berserkers can disembark 3 inches, then move their 6 inches, then 2 more if they've got the blessings. So it increases the movement and threat range of those Berserkers significantly, and it also protects the Berserkers, which is something that's relatively squishy. So a Rhino in a World Eaters army is a different kind of beast. They're really, really relevant. And there's also some really interesting combat tricks that we'll go through later that are going to break down things like being able to charge something that fights first with the Rhino, and then your Berserkers on one side, so that when they go to fight first, most of their unit have to hit the Rhino, and therefore they don't hit the Berserkers that just charged. Things like that. There's some really interesting stuff you can do. So Rhinos are absolutely fantastic. They're also just cheap, tough. They're good for objectives. They can go deploy teleport homers, or they can go cleanse things. They're just really effective in that regard as well. So I'm a huge fan of the Rhino, particularly in a World Eaters army. And then last but not least, I want to talk about Terminators. Now, this is something that the internet says are bad, but the internet is wrong. Terminators are fantastic. So they're a little bit more expensive than your 8-bound. However, you get 5 instead of 3, or 10 instead of 6. I'm a huge fan of a 10-man Terminator brick. And there's a few things that they do that 8-bound don't do. So the first is that they've got a 2-up save with a 4-up invulnerable save, which, if you have the 6-up Feel No Pain as well, so you got a 2-up, 4-up, 6-up, that on maths against almost every target is better than a 3-up, 5-up, 5-up of your Exalted 8-bound, right? So they're tougher than an Exalted 8-bound, and you get 10 of them instead of 6. So not only are they tougher, but you get more of them, which means this unit is like significantly tough compared to your Exalted 8-bound. It also has a bunch of ranged weapons. I prefer just max combi bolters and Reaper autocannons. However, there's an argument for the combi weapons as well. That's very meta dependent. The combi weapons are obviously better against your elite infantry, whereas the combi bolters are better against your smaller infantry. So, you can sort of take it or leave it. There's no real right answer to that one. However, the Reaper autocannons are significantly better than the heavy flamers and better than the combi weapons or combi bolters. So every time you have a unit of 10, you're going to want 2 Reaper autocannons, and then probably just the rest with combi bolters. And the Reaper autocannon is pretty good. Like, it's 4 shots, hitting on 3s, strength 7, AP 1 damage, and it's got 36-inch range. And what this allows this unit to do that no real other unit in the Warriors can do is it can rapid ingress somewhere, and then it can come out and it can shoot the unit that's downrange, that's running away or whatever, and then charge another unit. Whereas the Exalted 8-bound can only really do one thing, which is charge the nearest thing. So it adds a little bit of flexibility and diversity to the World Eaters list. It allows you to chip some wounds off that Mauler Fiends can go into. It means that if your opponent's running away with, like, let's say your 8-bound go in and they kill, out of say there's a unit of 10, Vanguard Marines or something. The 8-bound charge in and they kill 7, right? And now there's 3 guys left. And then in your opponent's turn, they run away. It's like, you don't want to send that unit of 8-bound to go now kill 3, Vanguard veterans. That's a waste of a unit. That 8-bound unit wants to hit another unit of 10, right? So being able to drop the Terminators in and now just shoot those 3 that are running away and kill them whilst charging something else is amazingly powerful. So the shooting is actually seriously relevant. And then their melee weapons, they're different than every Terminator. A lot of people think of them as just regular Terminators, but these guys have an additional strength and an additional attack, and then they get another additional strength and attack from the Blessings roll. So basically, a Power Fist on a normal Terminator is going to be 3 attacks, strength 8, whereas we've got 3 attacks, strength 9, and then we get another attack from the Blessings, 4 attacks, from the Detachment roll, and then another strength from the Detachment roll. So we're going in with 4 attacks that are strength 10 AP2, 2 damage. So these guys hit very hard. They don't have, if you're comparing them to Exalted 8-bound, they don't have the 2 different profiles, because you're going to have pretty much Power Fists on everybody. You're going to have 6 Power Fists in this unit, and probably 2 Chain Fists, and then 2 double Accursed Weapon, paired Accursed Weapon. So you're going in with a lot of 2 damage attacks that are strength 10, whereas Exalted 8-bound can pivot between the strength 8 or the strength 7 Eviscerators or the strength 14 Chain Fists. You just have the one option. But it's a pretty good mid-range option. Like, you're going to be winning almost all infantry on 2+ because you're strength 10. And you also have the ability to get +1 to wound from that stratagem. So, pretty much everything you're winning on 2s. And even big things like toughness 10 vehicles. You're like, well, I'm winning you on 4s, and then I can spend a CP to win you on 3s, right? Whereas the Exalted 8-bound, they're going to be wounding you on a similar thing. And it's worth noting that because you have 10 of these guys, you're getting a lot more attacks than the Exalted 8-bound as well. So the damage output on these guys is also quite high, particularly when you consider their ability, which is that each time a model in this unit makes an attack, add 1 to the hit roll if this unit is below starting strength, and add 1 to the wound roll if it's below half strength, right? Now, normally that sounds like a really bad ability because it doesn't activate until you've taken damage. But when you're taking 10 Terminators, chances are you're going to charge one thing, kill it, pile into another, force it to attack. It's going to kill maybe one model. Then in your opponent's turn, they're going to put a bunch of bullets into you, but they're probably not going to wipe out all 10 Terminators. Especially if you play them safe, you stay outside of charge range of your opponent's big threats, you stay outside of shooting range of most of their army, you're just killing things, picking them off. You're going to make it so that when they attack, they don't wipe the unit, and then on your next turn, you charge in and you actually do even more damage after you've taken some wounds yourself. That's wild. Most units immediately start reducing in damage output as they take wounds, whereas these guys dial up, which is really, really fantastic. And it's one of the things that separate them from the Exalted 8-bound, because the Exalted 8-bound, as they start losing models, they just get worse, whereas these guys get better. So there's tons and tons of arguments there for why you would want to consider the World Leaders Terminators. So that is the last of the data sheets. So we've talked about all of the different units that are available to World Leaders, and we're going to break down some list examples in a moment and how you can fit these units together. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Hi, I'm Dean Simbeck, President and CEO of Blog for the Blood God's exclusive high quality dice warehouse and emporium. Due to a shipping error, I'm currently overstocked with Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice, and I'm passing the savings on to you! Roll 9-inch charges, pass invulnerable saves, roll high for damage, and score lots of hits. Check out the links in the description of this video to pick up your set today. Alrighty guys, let's break down a few different army lists with different combinations of those units discussed. Now, it's worth noting that these army lists aren't set in stone and they're not all necessarily going to be top table competitive lists. Take them with a grain of salt, mix in elements that you like based on the conversation that we've just had about the units, but these are some good starting points for your lists. So the first one that we're going to talk about is, I call it the balanced meta list. This is pretty much the standard go-to for most people in competitive tournaments that do quite well. So you're going to start with Angron as your warlord, you're going to have Khorne, Lord Invocatus, and you're going to have a Master of Executions with the Favored of Khorne, which is going to mean that the chances of you getting your advance and charge is really high because you can re-roll those blessings. Lord Invocatus is going to grant you scout moves, Khorne is doing what Khorne does well, and you've got Angron as well. Now, for battle line units, we're going to have 2 units of Jackals. This is going to allow you to sticky your home objective, screen out your opponent, and bully their midfield with small units if they've got small units on their midfield. And then we're going to have 1 unit of 10 and 1 unit of 5 Khorne Berserkers. Now, the idea with these is if obviously you're going to add Master Executions to one and Khorne to the other, and then basically, depending on your matchup, you choose which was which. If you're going into a real combat-heavy meta and you're expecting to verse lots and lots of combat armies, you might put Master of Executions in those matchups, and then in the matchups where you're versing something that's not combat-heavy and you really want to just dial the damage output of that 10-man up, you're going to put Khorne in the 10-man. And there's also a world where you run Khorne on his own as well. Then we're going to talk about the Rhino. So you add a Rhino, and the idea here is that you're generally going to deploy one of the units in the Rhino and the other one nearby. And then in your first turn, you're going to be able to disembark out that unit, get that huge distance on it, charge something, kill it, and then embark the second unit, then move the Rhino. And that way you're going to be able to get that second unit into a staging position where it's able to do damage in the next turn. And also, if you have a unit that's not inside a Rhino, it's a valid option for the Scout move. So you can do a lot of different stuff there with Rhinos. Then the list has 2 units of regular 8-bound, 1 6-man Exalted 8-bound, and a Mauler Fiend. So your 2 units of regular 8-bound, they have scout independently, so they don't require it from Lord Invocatus. They're able to go off and do their own thing, and they're also able to provide those auras. And then the big unit of 6 Exalted is going to get Scout from Lord Invocatus, and his other Scout is going to go on one of your Berserker units. So you're going to be able to scout up pretty much your whole army, everything except for Angron and the Mauler Fiend. It's going to scout, and the Rhino, of course. And that means you've got massive amounts of scouts. The regular 8-bound are really good at bullying your mid-strength enemy units, like if they've got a unit of 10 Marines or something like that on an objective. A unit of 3 8-bound's really effective at killing those. And then your Exalted 8-bound is for dealing with your opponent's hard targets. They're really, really good at going in and just doing massive damage. They also, being a 6-man unit, can spread out quite wide, which means that if you're engaging your opponent on multiple fronts and they go to fall back, they're going to have to take multiple tests. That's really effective. And then the Mauler Fiend is there to gain advantage from the Tank Shock stratagem, which is one of the best stratagems in the game. He does the best use of it, so he's fantastic for that. And he also brings some more really, really high damage attacks. So if your opponent does have things that are neg-1 damage, you send Angron for one of them, the Mauler Fiends for the other, and you can take those out without having to deal with the fact that your 8-bound are only 2 damage. So that's one balanced meta-style list. This is modeled off of the ones that you will have seen winning tournaments recently. And then every other list is basically going to be a variant on that. So think of that list as your starting point, your standard, and then we're going to talk about some different ways that you can vary it up. So the first one I call the MSU Trade War list, and this one is all about having lots and lots of units. So you've got Angron, of course. Angron's going to be in almost every list because he's absolutely fantastic. But from there, we have Lord Invocatus, and we have 3 units of Jackals. Now, like I said in the previous list, Jackals are really good at trading for your opponent's small things. If they put something small on an objective, you can go, cool, I'm going to send Jackals, and first of all, I'm going to have 10 OC on the objective now, so I'm probably going to take it off you anyway. But the Jackals can kill 5 Battle Sisters, they can kill 5 Scouts, they can kill 5 Flayed ones, or whatever it is that your opponents put out. So Mandrakes, they're really good at killing stuff like that. And then in our other data sheets, we've got 3 units of regular 8-bound and 3 units of Exalted 8-bound. And then 2 of those Exalted 8-bound are going to get Scout Move from Lord Invocatus, and the 3rd unit of Exalted 8-bound is going to go in Deep Strike for Rapid Ingress. So now basically you're going to have 2 units of Exalted Scouting, you're going to have 3 units of regular 8-bound Scouting, you're going to have Lord Invocatus scouting himself, so you're going to have a brutal Alpha Strike, you're going to push out with all that sort of stuff, followed by an Ocean of Jackals. And then we round out the list with 3 Chaos Spawn and a Mauler Fiend. So again, those Chaos Spawn, really good trading pieces, really effective, and the Mauler Fiend is also really good at killing those hard targets. So you've got a lot of really, really good trading pieces in here, and you're able to do things like put Chaos Spawn out onto an objective, and your opponent has to respond with something, and generally, with Chaos Spawn, they have to overcommit, because those things are ridiculously tough. They're only 65 points, and there's almost no 65-point unit in the game that's going to effectively kill 2 Chaos Spawn. So they're going to have to put in something bigger, the bigger unit, to kill your Chaos Spawn, and then you can respond to that big unit with your 8-bound that you've scouted into some safe position. So that's the trading army, and the idea here is that every time they put something out onto an objective, you're able to put the right tool in to deal with it. If they put something big out, you send Angron, or you send a Mauler Fiend. If they put something medium-sized out, you send the Exalted 8-bound or the regular 8-bound. If they put something small out, you send a World Eater's Spawn or you send the Jackals. And as a result, you're never overcommitting, but you're forcing them to overcommit regularly. And you're able to sort of just basically keep up that trade long term because you have so many units, you can just keep trading over and over and over and really make it hard for your opponent to get a foothold on those central objectives. This is a really fun playstyle, but yeah, that's the MSU Trade Wars style list. Then we've got a Khorne Berserker heavy list. Now, Khorne Berserkers are absolutely fantastic. Like I said when talking about their data sheet, their ability to Blood Surge move onto objectives and tag your opponent and all the stuff they can do with fights first is absolutely wild, and this list leans heavily into that. So you've got Angron as your Warlord, you've got Khorne, you've got Lord Invocatus, and you've got 2 Masters of Executions. We've given one of them Favored of Khorne, and the other one Battle Lust. So now you've got one unit that's going to free heroically intervene, and another unit that's going to allow you to reroll those Blessings rolls to make sure you get your Advance and Charge, to make sure you get your Fights on Death, to increase your chances of resurrecting Angron. Then we've got 1 unit of Jackals, and we've got 2 units of 10 Khorne Berserkers. Now, basically, we've got 2 Master of Executions in Khorne, and 2 units of 10 Berserkers. So you can either put Master of Executions in both, and now you have 2 units that have fights first. It's going to be really hard for combat armies to deal with. Or you can put Khorne in one of them and have the other Master of Executions on his own. If you do that, you obviously use the Favourite of Khorne one, you put him on his own. And there's a few different ways that you can wield that to really powerful effect. We then have a single Rhino. Now you might be wondering, if you got 2 Berserker units, why only 1 Rhino? And the idea, like I said in the previous list, is that you deploy 1 unit inside. Turn 1, it's going to disembark out, go do some damage, or go jump on an objective or something like that. Then the second unit's going to embark, and then it's going to move. It's worth noting also in this that because you have Khorne as a solo, you can put Khorne in the Rhino and have both units of Berserkers on the field near Lord Invocatus, and you can scout move both units of Berserkers if you want, or if you want, you can scout move one somewhere safe and then scout move the other to embark in the Rhino. So there's a few different tricks you can do there when you have multiple units like that. But generally speaking, Lord Invocatus is going to want to give his scout move to the 2 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound that we have in this list. And then you've got 2 units of regular 8-bound that have scout moves inbuilt. So essentially the way this is going to function is you're going to have 2 units of scouts, 2 units of 8-bound scouting. You're going to have 2 units of Exalted 8-bound scouting. Then you're going to have 2 units of Berserkers, 1 in a Rhino ready to disembark onto an objective, and another ready to embark in the Rhino and then move off in another direction. Meanwhile, you've got Angron going in the middle, and Jackals sticking your home objective and screening out your opponent's drops and those sorts of things. So this is a really fun list. The fact that you're able to use those Berserkers like that, often when you throw a unit of Berserkers onto an objective, your opponent sits there and they just can't deal with it. They just don't know how to take that objective from you. If they charge you, you're going to fight first and kill them. If they try to shoot you, you're going to blood surge into them. And if they shoot you from far enough away, you're just going to spend a DP to stick at the objective. So you can make it really, really hard for your opponent to deal with your Berserkers. And then you have another unit. So you can do that 2 places at once, and it gets really hard for your opponent. They just don't know how to deal with it. So it's really, really effective. It's really, really fun. And it also feels very World Eaters because you've got lots of Berserkers, but you've also got lots of 8-bound. It's very thematic. It's very cool. I like the Berserker list. Now let's talk about something that diverges from the norm a little bit, which is the Mechanized World Eaters list. Now this is something that's been putting up some pretty good results around the world. It's a variant of that list where you've got Angron, you've got 2 units of Jackals, because every mechanized list is going to need something that can control objectives and something that can, do actions and those sorts of things. You've got 2 units of Jackals. Then we have the Khorne Lord of Skulls, the Big Daddy himself. And then we have 3 Forge Fiends, Hellbrute, and 3 Mauler Fiends. So you've got 6 Mauler Fiend-esque bodies, 3 of them designed for shooting, 3 of them designed for melee. You've got a Hellbrute, you've got a Lord of Skulls, and you've got Angron. I like in this one putting the Hellbrute in strategic reserves and 1 Mauler Fiend in strategic reserves, and then you can basically rapid ingress or deep strike and charge whichever one you want. The Mauler Fiends are really good for just a standard deep strike charge because they come on and then they can get +2 to that charge if the Lord of Skulls has shot at something and done some damage. So that's really effective. And then the Hellbrute is really good for a rapid ingress because he comes on and then he's able to move out in your turn, charge something, and fight into infinity. When he fights something, kills it, piles into something else, it fights him, he then fights back, kills it, piles into something else. You can string him and create some pretty wild combos with the Hellbrute. And then all of that is supported by the Forge Fiends, which are battle shocking things when they shoot things. Really, really cool. So that's the mechanized list, and this list puts out probably the highest damage output of all of the lists that we've talked about, because you've got 3 Mauler Fiends, all of which are doing D6 plus 1 damage. You've got 3 Forge Fiends, all of which are doing flat 3 damage with all their shooting. You got the Lord of Skulls, which has a bunch of 3 damage and D6 plus 1 damage weapons, so he's really effective. And then, of course, you've got Angron as well. So there's really, really high damage ceiling on this. And it's also arguably one of the toughest lists, because there's so many big mech bodies. The people's bolters are doing nothing into you. So it's a really tough list, and it's a really high damage output list. The area where this list struggles is with actions and things like that. And if you're on a particularly dense terrain, it's really hard to maneuver your units. So that's going to be very dependent on what your terrain is going to look like as to whether this list is going to function well. Next, we have a Lord of Skulls list. Now, this list is kind of halfway between the mechanized list and the standard meta list. We've got Angron and Lord Invocatus. You've got a single unit of Jackals for your home objective. You've got 2 units of regular 8-bound. You've got 3 units of Exalted 8-bound, one of them being the big unit of 6. And then on top of that, you have the Khorne Lord of Skulls. Now, this list is going to be really good because it's going to be able to effectively bring back Angron. You're going to have Angron and a lot of skulls bullying anything that's not in terrain, and then you're going to have lots of 8-bound that are able to bully the things that are in terrain. So you're going to be able to do some really interesting stuff there. So I'm a big fan of the Lord of Skulls. It's one of my favorite models. It's also a ton of fun to play because it's just this big, scary brick of hard to kill, really high damage stuff. It's almost always hyper impressive when you play it. You'll always be surprised at how tough it is to kill and how much damage it does to your opponent. It's pretty wild. And then the last list we're going to look into is a non-Gron list. So this is a list if you didn't want to take Angron. Like, there's a lot of people out there that believe Primarchs don't belong in the 40k universe. They should exist in the history of the 40k universe, and bringing them into the present kind of breaks that. I understand that perspective, so I've written a list here that doesn't include Angron for those of you who hold that stance. So you've got Khorne the Betrayer, you've got a Master of Executions with Battle Lust, so he's getting that free heroic intervention. You've got 2 units of Jackals, you've got 2 units of Berserkers, so it's similar to the Berserker list that we talked about earlier. It's got 2 Rhinos now, and it's got 2 units of regular 8-bound, 3 units of regular 8-bound, 1 unit of Exalted 8-bound, 2 Spawn, and then 3 Mauler Fiends. Now, one of the weaknesses you'll experience if you take Angron out of the list is you're going to not have that really durable unit, and you're also not going to have something that has that really high damage. So I recommend if you are going to take him out of the list, you want to put in a bunch of Mauler Fiends so that you're able to do those really high damage attacks. You also want lots of Exalted 8-bound and things like Mauler Fiends because they're going to be hitting on 2s often, so you're not as reliant on Angron's reroll hits aura. You know, the Mauler Fiends, as long as the target has taken some damage, you're going to be hitting on 2s. So you're going to be using CP to battle shock that, so to tank shock things when you go in, and that's going to allow you to get +1 to hit on the rest of your attacks. Really, really good. And you're going to be wanting to use those Exalted 8-bound because they hit on 2s with their Eviscerators, so you're not relying on Angron for dealing the heavy damage, and you're not relying on him for your rerolls. The one thing you will lack in this list is something that can fly, so people can try to block you out, which is why we've gone for additional Berserkers and 8-bound, because they're able to move through terrain, so it's a little bit harder to block their path than it is to block something like your Mauler Fiends. So that's my non-Gron list. Now, you're probably wondering why we didn't have any lists with Demon allies, and why we didn't have any lists with Chaos Knights allies, and for what it's worth, I just think that those things don't work with the World Eaters. The World Eaters have some of the best army rules and some of the best stratagems in the game, and you can't use those stratagems or the army rules on your allied demons or your allied Chaos Knights. So if you're going to try to ally in, say, a Carnivore from your Chaos Knights, you're actually better off just taking a Mauler Fiend, because that Mauler Fiend now gets all of your army rules, and you can use all of your stratagems on it. Whereas the Carnivore, even though point for point the Carnivore might be slightly more competitive than a Mauler Fiend, the fact that it doesn't gain access to any of your abilities makes it kind of meh. So I don't necessarily think that the Chaos Knights are the answer. You know, like you could take a Brigand, or you could just take a Forge Fiend, right? It's similar enough in the way that it's a relatively tough shooting unit that puts out decent shooting damage. But the Forge Fiend, if somebody kills it and it's on an objective, you can spend a CP to sticky the objective. You know, if you need to advance that Mauler Fiend to get onto an objective, you can auto advance at 6. You know, there's a few things you can do with the Forge Fiend you just can't do with a Brigand. So I don't reckon Chaos Knights are valid. And then if you're taking demons, well, with the new balance starter slate, you have to take a unit of Bloodletters for every non-battle line unit you take, which means you either take a Bloodletter unit and one character to lead them, in which case, that's it. Or if you want to take something like a Soul Grinder, or you want to take like Flesh Hounds, or something like that, well, now you have to take a unit of Bloodletters, and Bloodletters with no character leading them are quite unimpressive. They're 120 points, and they're really easy to kill. So, for what it's worth, I just don't think the demons work. I don't think the Chaos Knights work. I think you're better off just going pure World Eaters. And if you want to add those things in for a little bit of flex, the Chaos Knights are okay in the way that they're fast and they have a high OC value. So they're good for your objective play, I guess. And the Bloodletters with the Skull Taker in it do decent melee damage. So they're something that's a valid rapid ingress target. You can deep strike that behind some ruins somewhere in your opponent's turn and then come out and do your damage. Just beware that those guys can't use any stratagem support and they die relatively easily. They do have a high damage ceiling, but they're relatively squishy. In my opinion, you're better off just taking a couple units of 8-bound or something like that instead, but you're more than welcome to put them in. One of the things I used to really like is the unit of Juggernauts, the unit of Blood Crushers with a character attached, but Now that you have to take a unit of battle line, you have to take bloodletters, and bloodletters without a character attached is a massive tax. And if you wanted a unit of blood crushers with a character, you would have to take 2 units of bloodletters, and all of a sudden that's probably more than 500 points, so it doesn't fit anyway. So unfortunately, I don't have any lists to recommend for you that contain allies, because world leaders are better off without them in almost all cases. So that rounds out the 6 different lists. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of those lists, which one you think suits your playstyle the most, and if you think there's any opportunities missed, before we go into talking about some different deployment examples and ways that you want to use these lists in your turn 1 and 2 to get maximum damage out of those units. Alrighty guys, now we're going to talk about how to deploy and what you're going to want to do in your first, 1 or 2 turns based on different deployment maps and different types of opponents. Now it's worth noting before we get into this, this is extremely general advice. We're going to do some real specific and detailed advice later, but what we're going to talk about here are some general deployment principles, some things that you're going to want to consider when deploying, and then adapt that to your opponent, adapt that to the mission, those sorts of things. So what I've got here is I've got a few different examples. So we've got one deployment here. This is from the London Grand Tournament. This is a terrain layout that they have. Then we've got this here, which is one of the Games Workshop terrain layouts. And then we've got this, which is one of the World Team Championships terrain layouts. So these are the common types of terrain layouts that you can expect to see from tournaments. I've used the same mission and the same deployment zone layout for all 3 of these. However, it's worth noting there's obviously a ton of different deployment types and a ton of different terrains. If I was to try to break down all of them, we'd be here for 4 hours. So we're just going to use these as some examples to illustrate some sort of general advice on how to go about deploying these World Leaders armies. So let's take a look at this one first, and let's put some units down. Now let's assume that these green units up here, these are your opponent, right? That's their deployment zone. So chances are they're going to want to deploy themselves relatively close, but not shootable. That's what most people do. And we're going to do the same thing down here. We're going to deploy our red units down here. So one of the things worth noting when you're deploying is that you always want to make sure that your opponent just can't do any meaningful damage to you in the first turn. It's just unacceptable. You never want to let your opponent do that, because if they get first turn, you don't want them to just blow you up. So you would never deploy a unit here, right? Because that unit is just going to die if your opponent gets their first turn and they go, cool, they've got, this unit is deployed, down here somewhere. If you deploy there, they're just going to be able to move through the wall to there, and they're going to shoot you turn 1, and you're just dead. And that way you've had this unit which has actually achieved nothing of value, right? So you want to deploy your units, back here, where no matter what your opponent does in their first turn, they're not going to be able to shoot you. If this unit back here, which was this one, if he moves down this way, like that, he's not able to draw line of sight onto your unit. If he moves over here, again, not able to draw line of sight. And then his friend up here, if he moves in this way, he can't draw line of sight on you. If he moves out this way, he can't draw line of sight. So the goal is basically pick those areas on the table where, based on your opponent's movement and their shooting range, they are not able to shoot you turn 1. That's just a real golden rule of thumb. And if you have such a big army that you won't fit everything outside of that, consider putting some stuff in strategic reserves so that, again, your opponent is not going to be able to shoot you. Because getting shot turn 1 is just a disaster. Generally speaking, going first is a massive disadvantage if your opponent has deployed in such a way that you can't do any damage to them in that first turn. Because what it's going to mean is that in their turn, say they draw cleanse, they're going to be like, cool, this unit here, it's going to have to move on to that objective to get a cleanse, and this unit is going to have to move on to this objective to get a cleanse. And now in your turn, you're able to go, this unit charges that unit, this unit over here charges that unit, and now you're basically getting the alpha strike. You're getting to do damage to them first. And that's all facilitated by deploying conservatively and hiding everything. So that's really, really important, is that you want to make sure that under no circumstances are you letting your opponent get that alpha strike on you. And this is all facilitated by deploying conservatively. It's also worth noting that you want to deploy conservatively, but simultaneously as close to your opponent as you can. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to deploy perfectly in every game, but if you deploy something like what we have pictured here, if you do get that first turn, you're going to be able to go, cool, I'm going to scout move this unit to here. Then in my first turn, I'm going to move it up to here somewhere, right? And now I've got a pretty easy charge on that unit. And because of that, and you tell your opponent all of this at the start of the game, you tell them I can scout move 6, I can move up to 11 inches, I can then auto advance 6 and then charge. So you tell them you got a 23-inch move, then a charge, right? If you're in this corner here, you can hit pretty much anything over here with relative ease. So what they're likely to do is they're likely to go, oh no, I'm going to deploy back here, right? Hiding behind this ruin. And because they're so far back, now, if they deploy their whole army back here, obviously they're going to have more than 2 units, but if they deploy their whole army back here because they don't want to get charged turn 1, then you get the first turn. You're going to be able to go, cool, I'm going to scout move this unit, to here, and just toe in on that objective. And then I'm going to scout move, and then in my first turn, move this unit just to there, to toe in on that objective. And now in your opponent's turn, this guy, how's he ever going to shoot this guy over here? He can't, because if he moves out, unless he's got like a ridiculously long movement, but if he goes, cool, I'm moving up to here, well, he can't draw a line of sight on you. If he moves up to there, he can't draw a line of sight on you, So as a result, you've been able to take that objective, you're still safe, and now you've basically reset the problem. Because if they move forward back to their original, where they could have potentially originally deployed, well, now in your subsequent turn, you're able to send these guys in and do their damage like so. So deploying conservatively so that they can't do any damage to you if they go first, but also posturing aggressively so that if you get first, you're going to be able to do damage to them. That's the key to World Eaters. So let's break down another deployment type. So we've got another, sorry, not a deployment type, same deployment type, but a different terrain layout, right? Because obviously every tournament's going to have different terrain layouts, so it's worth noting, what's the best way to go. So with this one here, this is one of the Games Workshop ones, Terrain Layout 3. So basically in this one, you've got a nice little nook here where you can achieve that similar result that I was talking about, where you go, cool, I've got a couple of units deployed here, and, one unit, where's that one? There. One unit deployed down here. And if you deploy like that, your opponent is going to really struggle to do damage to you, because if they deploy, as aggressively as they want, they can deploy as aggressive as they want, which is like right here. Let's say that's a unit that's got like a 12-inch move and some serious shooting, right? Well, 12 inches, if that's 9 inches from the center, 12 inches gets you to like there somewhere. You can't shoot these guys, right? If they deploy over here, 12 inches gets them to like here, they can't shoot that guy. If they deploy over here, 12 inches gets them to like there somewhere, they can't shoot these guys. And as a result, you've deployed in such a way where when your opponent goes to deploy, they're just like, I can't shoot you, right? And if they can't shoot you turn 1, then their decision becomes to be outside of charge range, so that you can't charge them. So then in their first turn, they're going to deploy back, conservatively like this, so that if you go first, this guy here, for example, scout moves 6 inches, then he moves his 9, then he auto advances 6. He's probably not effectively charging this guy. He's going to deploy that guy a little bit further back so that he's a bit safer. And as a result, your turn 1 is also nullified. So now you have this situation where your turn 1 is nullified, but so is theirs, right? And then if you get the first turn, you can just go, cool, I'm going to scout this guy over here, and then I'm going to advance him, and he's going to hide in this ruin here, and probably hold the objective that's here, And then this other guy, he's going to do the same. He's going to, this guy at the front here, he's going to scout move up to here, and then he's going to move, and he's going to auto 6 his advance, and he's going to get in behind this ruin here and be safe. And then when it ticks over to your opponent's turn, they're going to be like, oh, well, now I'm all the way back here, and I still can't deal with these guys, but they're on objectives now, So what you're essentially doing is you're making it so that turn 1 doesn't matter for either person. So the game realistically starts at the start of turn 2, and you start on the objectives, and they start deep in their deployment zone. And that's a massive advantage. That's the main way that World Eaters get their big wins, because then at the start of the game, you're starting with primary points on the board already because you're on the essential objectives. You're in a really good position to score your objectives because you're on all those objectives in the center, and your opponent is hiding. They're weak. They're vulnerable. And that's really, really effective. This is also really effective against enemies that are planning to do their damage from deep strike, because, like, sure, if you're versing Grey Knights, these guys could have just at the end of your turn pick those units up and teleport them down in the middle or whatever. But because you're so spread out across the table, they're not going to be able to just have free use. They can't just go wherever they want. They're probably going to have to arrive back in their own deployment zone. And yeah, they're going to be able to deploy, here somewhere and shoot those guys. This guy can come down here, and because he's, in the terrain, he can shoot these guys. But now they're still more or less in their deployment zone. They haven't pushed out, they haven't got onto objectives, and they haven't set themselves up with a control. And then what you've probably done is with this final unit, which is this guy, if he deployed there, he's probably scout moved and moved in his first turn into here somewhere where he's safe. So even if they do drop there and kill that, now in your next turn, this guy's free to go out and kill that. So you're able to set up layers of trades, which is one of the reasons why that MSU trade war list that we talked about is really, really effective, because you're able to set up these things in safe spots and cycle and keep trading. You put a unit out onto an objective, they teleport down here, they shoot you off the objective, you spend a command point to sticky that objective, so now you still control it in your turn, and then the other unit that you've positioned here is able to go in and strike that unit. If he kills down here, if he goes, cool, he teleports his Dread Knight there, shoots your 8-bound off the objective, you're like, yep, no worries, I'll sticky that objective, and now this unit of 8-bound is going to go in and kill you. So that's a really effective way of doing it on this table. And then finally, we'll do a WTC table. So now you've got, this one's quite interesting. The WTC terrain is really, really dense. There's lots and lots of ruins on these, which is perfect for the World Eaters. The World Eaters love WTC because you're able to deploy in some really, really safe places. So for example, when you've got a scout move, you can deploy one unit here, and then another unit, in here, and then another unit down here, right? No, sorry, down. God damn it, sorry. Another unit down here. And now you can basically, in your first turn, you can scout move this guy into here. You can scout move this guy into here. And then you can scout move this guy into here. And now, wherever your opponent deploys, they're going to really struggle to do damage to you. So if they deploy hyper-aggressively, and they move 12 inches, they're going to struggle to get these guys. They're going to struggle to get that guy. And as a result, they're not going to do any significant damage to you if they go first. So again, they're going to deploy conservatively. They're going to deploy way back here, so that if you then get first turn, you can't just send this guy in and kill that guy. They're going to deploy outside of his threat range. But then what happens is, we tick over to your first turn, and this guy can now move and advance and get in behind here. And then this guy can move and advance and get in behind there. And then this guy can move and advance, get here, right? And now you're on all of the central objectives, and your opponent is so far away, they're going to really struggle to deal that damage to you. This guy might be able to move, if he's got really long movement, he might be able to hit that guy, but probably not. He's probably going to, because he'd have to get on the other side of that ruin to be able to hit that guy. So he's going to really struggle to deal damage to him. Then this guy down here, again, he's never hitting that guy because this terrain's blocking his path, right? So he's going to have to move through here and maybe shoot you off the center. But then, again, you can just sticky the center. And if you've simultaneously moved other units in your army up into these sort of central staging positions, right, here and here, well now, they kill that guy, but now you're free to jump over and kill what they sent out in response. And basically, you start trading with your opponent from turn 2. You almost never want to start the trades from turn 1. You want to basically use your turn 1 threat, posture up and scare them. They deploy really deep. Then you use your first turn to just stage, get on objectives, set up things where it's like, okay, there's a unit on objective here. In order for you to kill it, there's a unit on objective here. In order for you to kill it, you would need to be here. And I've set up another unit so that when you go there, I'm able to deal with you in response. And you're able to basically set up those layered trades to really effectively dominate the table. And the only exception to this that I will make, because I said basically you don't want to start the trades from turn 1. But let's say hypothetically you're playing on this WTC map, you've deployed something like this, right? Where you've got, where's the other red one? Is it this one? Yep, that one. You've deployed something like this, and your opponent has called your bluff, which is one of the things that is really effective into World Eaters, because our bluff is actually quite problematic. So they've gone, cool, you're going to charge me turn 1, that's fine, because I can't stop you, because if I deployed too deep, you're going to dominate the table anyway. So they go, cool, I'm just going to call you bluff. And they deploy a bunch of stuff on here. They deploy like, you know, a Land Raider Redeemer with a bunch of Blade Guard inside. They deploy a bunch of Gladiator Reapers. They deploy like, you know, a big unit of 20 Crusaders. Like they deploy the whole army on the line like that. Now you're actually forced, if you do get the first turn, now the tricky thing is if you get second, you're probably going to scout move backwards, right? Because if they go first, you don't want them to just charge you. You don't want them to blow you up, right? So you're going to scout move backwards somewhere safe. So this one might have to scout, you know, that way. This guy scouts down here somewhere. And now you're like, cool, I've scouted back. So their threat range, they can't charge me turn 1. They can't do any damage to me turn 1. And then in their turn, what they're going to do is they're going to go, cool, well, this Land Raider moves on to that objective. You know, this Gladiator Reaper over here, he moves, you know, over here somewhere so that he can now see through that ruin because he's wholly on the base, which means if you go anywhere in here, you're going to get shot. And then in your turn, you now need to use the fact that you have that huge threat range, that advance and charge, the +2 moves. You're going to have to use that so that you get these guys back into the objectives. But now you're not starting significantly ahead like you want to. So basically the goal is you need to posture up really aggressively so that if you get that first turn, you can go in and do the damage. But if you don't get that first turn, you can do, you know, the staging and set the tempo of the game. An interesting one could be something like this GW one. You could set up your guys instead, like right on the line there, right on the line here, and right on the line there. Because that way, if you get first turn, you're as close as you can possibly be to your opponent, right? But if you don't get first turn, and they've got things set up to shoot you, you can then go, cool, I'm going to scout move back behind this wall. I'm going to scout move with this guy back in behind this wall. And I'm going to scout move with this guy back in... Wrong guy. This guy back in behind this wall. So having the scout moves is massive on World Eaters because it allows you to basically threaten them and then either pull back if you need to pull back or go full send if you want to go full send. One of the advantages of going full send is your opponent's only going to have one command point at the start of the turn. So if they do have multiple combat bricks out, it's a really good opportunity to just send everything in and kill them so that they don't have the ability to interrupt you. They don't have the ability to neg 1 damage if they have that. Any really expensive stratagems, they're not going to be able to fund. And if you do start hitting them from turn 1, you're going to tax their command points. They're going to have to start spending them early, which means they're not going to have the ability to do all of the things that they had planned to do in later turns. So there's some advantages to going hard early, and there's some matchups you're absolutely going to want to do it. But just know that the standard playbook that you should be following is the one where you basically use your scout moves and your first turn to threaten them. They deploy conservatively, trying to hide from your threat. And then in your first turn, you just stage. You just position yourself, and then you treat it like that's your deployment. You treat it like that's where the game starts. And when you look at it, you realize, oh, the game starts now, and I'm on all the midfield objectives with primary score, and your opponent's deployed super deep and hidden. That's a really powerful position to start the game from. So that's my general advice on deployment, turn 1s and 2 with the World Eaters, and the best way to get the most. And this applies to all of the lists we talked about. It applies a little bit less to the mechanized heavy ones, but generally speaking, that advice is going to work for every World Eaters player on every mission, on every deployment. There's just little specifics about where you're going to place things that are going to vary from mission to mission. If you want more coaching on this sort of stuff and specifics, feel free to join the Patreon on there. For $100 a month, we do regular weekly phone calls. We do regular things where I'll open up the mission pack of the event that you're attending and we can go through it together if that's something that you're interested in. Or we can talk about specific opponents and how to deploy against them with your World Eaters. There's some really cool stuff that we can do on that Patreon. So if that's something you're interested in, absolutely check that out. And it's also just a great place to hang. We talk shit. We have good fun there. We memes and share things and hobby projects and all kinds of things. So if you want to join the Patreon, check it out. You can join for, I think it's $10 is the cheapest, all the way up to $100, which is going to get you the full coaching experience. So if that's something you're interested in, check it out. Links in the description. And let's just jump on to the last bit of the video where we're going to talk about some practical examples. Alrighty guys, now let's talk about some really detailed examples of some really powerful tricks that you can use with the World Eaters with your units specifically. So the first trick that I'm going to show you is one of the ways that you can use the stratagems and the units to secure your primary objectives no matter what your opponent tries to throw at you. So what we've got here is an objective marker. Let's say that this is the one in the center of the table that's, or one of the midfield objectives, right? What you might do is take your Lord Invocatus and a unit of Jackals, right? And what you might do, let's say your deployment zone is that way. You're going to have Lord Invocatus and Jackals. You can scout move the Jackals, then you can move them 8 inches with the blessings and auto advance them 6. So they're going to get a massive 14 inches out of your deployment zone, which if this is 9 inches from your deployment zone and you're going 14, you're going 5 inches past the center, which you can use essentially to get this unit of Jackals in a big line like this, making sure that the front of the Jackal is not within 3 inches of the objective marker. So it's important that the Jackals use their full 6-inch auto advance and their +2 move to get all the way past the objective, right? And then you use the Lord Invocatus' scout move to get on the objective himself. And then further to that, you've probably scouted some 8-bounds somewhere else and you've sent them down to do their damage. Now, what you've achieved here is really interesting because your opponent effectively has no way of taking that objective from you. So let's say your opponent has a big unit of Primaris Aggressors. Now, it doesn't really matter. There's any unit will do here. But hypothetically, Aggressors are good because they do good shooting and melee, right? If they want to take that objective from you, they actually can't do it, even if they're this close, because they can't move onto it, because they can't move over the Jackals, right? They could shoot Lord Invocatus, and now you don't have any models on the objective. But if they do that, you're going to spend a CP, and you're going to sticky the objective, right? So they're like, okay, cool, can't shoot him. If they shoot the Jackals, again, that achieves them nothing. And in their movement phase, if they go, cool, we're going to charge the Jackals, right? They're going to charge in like this. They're going to kill the Jackals. The Jackals are all gone, right? But now, these Jackals are all dead. But now, their consolidate move is not enough to get on that objective marker because you put your Jackals out further than 3 inches from the edge of the marker. And that means that those guys, even though they killed your Jackals, they could kill the Jackals and Lord Invocatus. There's no real effective way for them to get on the objective. It is important that you do require a decent sized unit like Jackals, because if you have Jackals like this, and they're back here somewhere, when they go to charge you, they have to base contact you, which means they're not going to be able to swing all the way around and get onto the objective like that. They're going to have to base contact you at the front there. So the thing to look out for, and the thing to do if your opponent tries something like this, is to just go, cool, how many shots does the aggressors get? You work out how many shots you would need to make in order to kill like half of the unit of Jackals. So if they shoot and they kill them, right, like that, now they can charge this guy, and this guy over here can pile in onto the objective. So you can go, cool, I'm going to charge here. These guys go, boop, 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 charge like that. This guy goes, boop, 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 because they can't base contact that Jackal because they're so far away. So they can go, boop, boop, boop. And then when they fight, they can activate and pile in onto the objective. So it's not a perfect situation, but it's one of those situations where if your opponent doesn't know the specific way to solve that challenge, they're going to really struggle. And you're basically going to lock down that objective. And you can also do some really interesting stuff with your casualty removal. Like, let's say they do shoot you and they do kill half of the unit. What you can do is you can go, cool, I'm going to remove one there, one there, one there, one there, like that. And now, when they go to charge, because you've left all of these gaps, yes, you're going to lose them Jackals at the end of the turn when you fail that coherency check, but this guy's going to have to base contact here, he's going to have to base contact there, 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 and there. And they can't actually use it to get through because now when they pile in, they're all in base contact, so they don't get to make a pile in move. Then they fight, they wipe the unit, and now because they're further than 3 inches from the objective, they don't get to make a consolidate move. So that's a really effective way if you're versing a combat or even a shooting heavy army and you want to lock down an objective. You can basically use your screen of Jackals that are 3 inches away from an objective marker and something like Lord Invocatus or a unit of 8-bound or Khorne or something cheap and throw away, or even another unit of Jackals for that matter, and you can basically sandbag that objective and prevent your opponent from taking it from you. So that's one really nifty trick. Alrighty, here's another nifty trick for you. Let's say you're versing a Blood Angels player, and he's got Mephiston attached to a big unit of Death Company or whatever, some big scary combat threat, and they've got a Brutalis Dreadnought here as well. So let's say, it doesn't really matter about the specifics of the units, but the key here is that they have fights first on this big scary combat unit. And obviously, if you charge straight into it, they get to fight first, and they're just going to kill you. So that's not acceptable. So there's a few ways that you can get around this. And basically what you're going to want to do in this scenario is charge Angron into the Brutalis Dreadnought, and then charge these 8-bound in as well. And they're hidden because of Angron's wings, so I didn't plan that very well. But basically they're going to charge in, and they're going to get around here, right? And now, because Mephiston's unit is not within engagement range, they're not eligible to be selected in the fight phase, then you're going to fight first with the Exalted 8-bound and kill this Brutalis Dreadnought. And now, because Angron declared a charge this turn, he is eligible to fight. So even though he's not within engagement range of that Brutalis Dreadnought that was the target of his charge, because he made one, he is eligible to fight, which means he's able to pile in. He's just going to go in like that. And now he's able to make his attacks into Mephiston's unit, even though Mephiston's unit had fight first. Because making a fight involves activating a unit, that unit then piles in, makes attacks, and consolidates. That is a fight. So this unit is able to basically, Angron's able to fight those guys, clean them all up before they get an opportunity to strike him. So that's a really effective way of using multiple units to get around your opponent's fights first. And that's a skill that you need to master as a World Eaters player, because all of your damage is coming from combat. If they have fights first and you're not able to effectively get around it, you're going to really struggle. So using a trick like that, where you basically charge 2 units in to something that doesn't have fight first, you fight it with something, kill it, and then you pile into it, that's really effective. This also works, let's say it's not Mephiston's unit, let's say that it's a unit that doesn't have, fights first. It's just like, let's do another example. Alright, so here's another example of how you can use 2 units to dominate the combat phase. Let's say you've got Angron here and a unit of Khorne Berserkers, and your opponent has 2 Brutalis Dreadnoughts, and he has 2 command points in his pocket. If you were to charge Angron into one, and then the Berserkers into the other, right? Your opponent, you're going to go, cool, well, I made the charges, and it's my turn, so I'm fighting first. And then you would go, cool. The Berserkers, I think I have 12 Berserkers there, but whatever. Let's say you fight first with the Berserkers, and you kill this, right? Then, before you select him to activate with Angron, your opponent is going to fight, be able to spend 2 command points, and they're going to be able to fight with that Dreadnought, and probably kill Angron, which is a problem. Then, if you instead go, okay, well, I can't tolerate that, I cannot accept that, so instead I'm going to fight with Angron first. Angron fights, he kills the Dreadnought, well, now he can spend 2 command points and interrupt and kill these Berserkers. So if your opponent has 2 units like this, and you've got no real effective way of dealing with them outside of melee, how do you defeat those 2 units when your opponent has 2 command points for a command interrupter, or whatever it's called, counteroffensive, right? And the trick is, quite simply, charge Angron into one, charge the Berserkers into the same one, right? But when you do the charge, you're going to position like this or something, right? And now these Berserkers can't get within base contact of that guy, so they're going to be able to swing around like this and get real. They're going to have to end closer to the target of the charge, but they don't have to end within engagement range or base contact, so they're going to go like this. Now, this guy's not within engagement range and therefore can't be activated to fight, so you're going to fight first. You're going to kill this one with Angron, right? Now, your opponent can't spend 2 command points to interrupt because this guy's not within engagement range, so he can't fight. Then, now you get to activate your next unit that declared a charge, which is the Khorne Berserkers, and they're all going to pile in like so, and they're going to get all of their attacks into this Dreadnought, and you're going to kill it. So even though your opponent had the 2 CP to interrupt, because of the way you've sequenced your charges and sequenced your fights, you've been able to kill both of their combat threats without them being able to use the command points to interrupt you. Alrighty guys, so we've talked about ways to secure and defend an objective using jackals and using berserkers, using fights first, using all of the different tricks we have at our disposal, and we've also talked about some ways that you can get around your opponent when they're trying to use tricks like fights first or combat interrupts or things like that. Now let's talk about transports, because one of the areas world leaders really struggle is dealing with opponent transports, because we can't shoot them dead, we don't have the damage in the shooting phase to do it, and when we charge them, we're not able to charge the contents of the transport effectively, right? So what we're going to do in this situation is we've got a unit of aggressors inside this repulsor, executioner or repulsor or whatever, right? Basically what we're going to do is we're going to move Angron up and we're going to charge so that we touch the back end of the transport. And then we're going to move and charge our berserkers in such a way, they all have to base contact, but you want to make sure that you're doing it in such a way that you're leaving a gap at the back of the transport here, close to Angron, and you're basically making it so that they can't disembark out this way because they can't end that disembark within 1 inch of the berserkers. And the best way to do that is, like, obviously you have to base contact with everybody that you can, and then with the last guys that can't, you basically want to put one like there, and one like there. And basically now when they go to disembark, they can't place themselves in here because the whole unit can't fit. It would be within engagement range of those berserkers. If you had wrapped around here, they would go, cool, I can't disembark at all, so I'm going to use the emergency disembark and I'm going to jump over you. But because they haven't, what you're going to do is you're going to fight, you're going to kill that with the berserkers. Then, because you're getting reroll hits, remember, from Angron, you're getting, lethal hits potentially, so rerolling those hits with lethal hits with +1 to wound from a stratagem, they're going to kill that transport with ease. And then your opponent has no choice but to disembark out like that, because it's the only legal place to be disembarked that's within 3 inches of the dead transport. So the berserkers have fought, they've killed the transport, you remove that, then your opponent has disembarked there, and because Angron made a charge this turn, he is now eligible to pile into and fight those aggressors. And now you've been able to effectively deal with the transport and its contents in a single fight phase. So that's one of the ways that you can get around the opponent having transports. And now you've put yourself in a position where you've still got those berserkers, they're on the objective, you've got Angron on the objective, your opponent's now put in that same previous position where they're going to really struggle to deal with those berserkers, because if they come down, shoot them, you're going to blood surge into them. If they try to charge you, you're going to fight first. They're not going to be able to do much. So it's a really, really effective and really powerful way of dealing with transports. There is one other really effective way of dealing with transports that's quite simple, and that is to just not deal with the transport. So what we're going to do here, same scenario, we've got the repulsor, it's got a whole bunch of aggressors inside of it, and what we're basically going to do is we're going to move these berserkers, we're going to advance and charge, we're going to do all of the different tricks we need to do to get maximum distance on these guys, and we're actually just going to ring all the way around the transport with our charge. Because we've got such massive move, because we're making big charge ranges, this shouldn't be that big of an issue, and a unit of 10 berserkers is going to be enough that you're going to be able to do something like this, right? And then, when you fight, you don't spend any command points to increase your damage output, you don't take the lethal hits, you make sure you're not near Angron, so you're not rerolling your hits, and if you are near Angron, you reroll your successful hits, not your fails, right? Because the goal here is to not kill the transport. And then basically what's going to happen is we don't kill the transport, then it goes into our opponent's turn. That transport can't move because we're there. So if it tries to move, it's going to have to take a desperate escape test and possibly die. And if it dies, the unit that's inside is not going to be able to disembark, so it's going to have to do a heroic intervention, which means a bunch of them are likely to die. And if it stays there, because of where those berserkers are, there's nowhere that your opponent can place their unit wholly within 3 inches of that transport, which means they can't disembark at all, which means they're going to stay in there. And then in your opponent's turn, that's when you go, cool, now we're re-rolling our hits, now we're taking the lethal hits, now we're spending the CP for +1 damage, and we're going to kill that in their turn. So then you kill it in their turn, they use their disembark, they go over here with their desperate escape test, and then you now go, cool, now we tick over into my turn, and I'm free to charge that unit that just disembarked. So that's a really effective way of dealing with the transport by not dealing with the transport. It can be kind of hard to do. Sometimes you require 2 units. You might want to put 10 berserkers on this side and another 10 on that side, just to make sure that there's no eligible places for them to disembark. And you've also got to note that, they can just move the transport out, so that's something to consider. But depending on the situation, that transport might be dying on a roll of 1 or 2, And as a result, you're pretty happy with that because now you're killing it in their turn as opposed to killing it in your turn. You've taken the objective off them, and it's going to be really hard for them to get on that objective in their turn. So there's some really interesting stuff there. It's not always going to work, but it's a theory and a stratagem that's worth considering. All right, this next trick is going to be one with a Hellbrute. Really cool, little, simple unit. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to move our Hellbrute on to the objective. We're going to flamethrower some of these Marines, kill a couple. Then what we're going to do is we're going to charge just the Marines. When we fight, we've got a bunch of attacks that are going to be wounding on 2s with reroll wounds, high AP, high damage. So we're going to kill a whole bunch of them. Let's say we kill another 5, right? With our 6 attacks, rerolling everything. Right? Now, we've gone in, we've charged, we've hit, we've done this. We can tank shock if you need to do additional damage as well. Now, we go into our opponent's turn of the fight phase, and they have to fight with these 3 Marines into that Dreadnought, because it's within engagement range. You cannot choose not to fight, which means they're going to have to pile in, they're going to fight, they're going to struggle, they're not going to kill it, because it's 3 regular Marines. And now, because they allocated attacks into me, I get to fight again. And now I can kill those 3, pile into these aggressors. If I pile into them around this way, now those aggressors have to fight, because they're within engagement range. They're going to pile in. They're probably only going to get to fight with like 3 or 4, right? They now fail to kill me, right? Because now, when they go to fight me, I can use neg 1 damage. So their 2 damage power fists don't kill me. And then it's like, oh, cool, you just made attacks into my Hellbrute. I get to fight again. And I'm going to kill, 3 or 4 of them. And now all of a sudden, that one Hellbrute has just gone in and through multiple fights has cleaned up a whole area of the board. A single Hellbrute, if you can get it into the right position, is monumentally disastrous for your opponent. It's completely crazy. So that's a really cool trick that you can do with the Hellbrute. Alrighty guys, and there you have the World Eaters Masterclass. I hope you found that useful, and I hope you learnt some things along the way. If you did, like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below, and let's get a conversation going about the World Eaters. And if you would like to, as I said earlier, feel free to join our Patreon where we do one-on-one coaching and we really deep dive specific matchups, specific challenges, and talk about specific ways that you can beat your particular opponents that you're struggling with. If you've got a local guy who's running a menace in your local area and you want to know how to beat him, joining our Patreon is a great way where we can have those conversations and talk about things that you can do to increase your probability of winning those matchups. And we also just hang out there. It's great hobby channel. We talk stuff. We talk memes. It's a fantastic little community. So if you want to join that, then that's fantastic. And I look forward to seeing you there. And with that being said, thanks for tuning in. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment, he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.